colors rippled faintly through the square tiles, the runes softly pulsating at set intervals. The floor was made of reinforced materials and further enchanted on top of that. It was clearly designed to withstand, or at least undo in real time, the damage caused by violet-level spells. Kasrith stood by the edge of the arena alongside the other contestants, waiting for the tournament's managers to announce the start of the competition. Several rows of spectator seats towered over them, packed to the brim with people. They were protected by a thick, transparent dome that had also been enchanted to the high heavens. All things considered, the venue reminded Percy of the blood-stained Colosseum on Hue. Only, this isn't a place for slaves forced to fight for their lives, just willing participants, here for fame, glory, and rewards. According to Kasrith, the lives of the contestants weren't at risk. The arena had been enchanted by an actual god to protect them the moment they were about to receive a lethal wound. Of course, it was still in their best interest to avoid ending up in that situation, as they would be disqualified should the enchantments activate. Either way, Percy was quite impressed by the runework involved. Even though the Thescalon's enchantments fell a little short compared to the vaults, a large-scale project like this arena, and one personally built by such high-level individuals, was leaps and bounds above what Percy was currently capable of. Especially since this pillar wasn't the only one of its kind. 7 more were faintly visible in the distance, every single one of them matching in height. Percy didn't think the Thescalons had just happened to find 8 equally tall pillars at the same place, so he guessed that they had been cut short on purpose, to give the contestants the same conditions throughout the tournament. And these were just the venues for the blue grade of this particular regional tournament. 8 more were located farther away for the violets, and 9 similar competitions could be found elsewhere across the planet. They needed that many because Kasrith's tournament alone would involve hundreds of fights. The early rounds, at least, had to be conducted in parallel, or the event would drag on for months. The mist wasn't very thick inside the arena either. Percy guessed there were enchantments for that too, keeping the clouds away from the summit of the pillars. Not that the decreased visibility would have made a huge difference to the elite blues fighting, but there seemed to be low-born children among the spectators. This was also the reason the pillars were so short, otherwise some of the kids would have trouble breathing. Who gets to watch these tournaments anyway? Percy asked, still unclear on the Greater Springs demographics. Based on what his host had told him, he assumed that the planet was full of powerful sects that functioned similarly to the noble houses on Remir. Obviously, there were way more of them here, and the average grade of their members was much higher, but they were still military organizations focused on cultivating new bloodlines and spells, competing against one another for resources and influence, occasionally producing powerful gods and demigods as a result. A lot of the crowd comes from the sects themselves. The leaders want to see how their subordinates perform, but also to keep up with the development of their rivals, scout new members, and get ideas for new avenues of research, Kasrith explained. But we have more than just sects on Thescala. There are lots of small villages scattered atop the pillars, like the one you found me in. We also have many large cities with factions that focus on arts, commerce, and other things unrelated to combat. Many of the richer folk bring their families here for entertainment. There are actually even more watching from home via transmission enchantments. Percy drew a sharp breath at that. His host hadn't lied when he said these regional tournaments were a big deal. Even though his life wasn't at risk, and his existence wasn't known to anyone but Kasrith and Cyrnith, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease at the thought of being watched by millions of people. After all, he was used to fighting in remote locations, rarely leaving any survivors behind. I really hope nobody recognizes Metatron's runes. The good news was that only gods and demigods who had left the planet before stood a chance of having encountered the vault's magiscript in their travels. Percy had no idea if such people would even bother watching these tournaments. Even if they did, there were over 100 venues around the planet, so those focusing on Kasrith's fights would be even fewer. This content has been misappropriated from Novelbin. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. That should be the case during the early rounds, at least. The better Percy and his host did, and the higher up the rankings they climbed, the more eyes would fall on them, however, and the more attention they would receive. Percy's only hope at that point would be that anyone who found Casrith's abilities strange would wait until after the tournament to approach him. By then, Percy would be gone, and his host wouldn't be able to tell them much. Oblivious to Percy's thoughts, the Blue went back to examining his new tunic, his fingers gently tracing over the violet embroidery. A shit-eating grin was plastered all over his reptilian face, or the closest expression somebody with just a pair of long fangs could make. Casrith had been like this ever since they passed the evaluation a couple of weeks ago, still gleeful over his newly elevated status. "How vain are you?" Percy asked, rolling their eyes. "It's just a piece of cloth." Granted, he was also happy they'd earned the trim, but only because the elder conducting the assessment had seemed hesitant to pass them. Casrith could certainly unleash some powerful attacks, especially after the addition of Percy's runes, but his strength was lacking in other areas. Luckily, the Violet had ultimately decided that Casrith's overall ability was more deserving than undeserving of the trim. "You don't understand," the Thescalan snapped back indignantly. "Being an elite disciple will massively affect how I'm treated in the sect. I'll get more resources and be allowed to choose my own missions from now on. Aren't you worried that you'll be exposed as a fraud the moment I leave?" Percy asked, mostly to tease his host. He still hadn't told him about the second core that would eventually change his life for real. In fact, he wasn't sure Casrith would even discover the decree on his own within the next century. The Blue relied on his bloodline to regenerate his body, so Percy doubted the man came into contact with life mana that often. Thus, accidentally learning about his second core would probably take a while. Not really. Like I previously said, 9 out of 10 elite disciples buy or cheat their way in, so there's an unwritten rule to let them be. Nobody dares to ask them to prove their strength, as people don't want to piss the wrong demigod off. Once you get the trim, it's extremely difficult to lose it. Percy felt a bad taste in his mouth, not only because he disapproved of this rotten system, but also because he didn't like the thought of having permanently raised his bastard host's status in the eyes of his people. He had yet to decide how to deal with Casrith. On one hand, the idea of using somebody, even one as twisted as his current host, and then discarding him the moment he got what he wanted didn't sit well with him. On the other, he didn't want to leave a monster who would inevitably go on to slaughter more villages alive, especially after helping him grow even stronger. This was the same reason Percy had chosen to put down Rambert back in the Whistling Woods. "I'll deal with things as they come," he thought, sighing inwards. For now, he had to borrow the Blue's strength to get the life-extending leaf from Thescala. As for what happened later, perhaps the most humane option would be to dump Casrith in the vault, where he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else in the short term. Hopefully. Not that giving Metatron another pawn, a 2-cord Blue with an extended lifespan and a composite affinity, no less, was much better, but it would likely be centuries or even millennia before the Thescalan was powerful enough for the Titan to deploy on external missions. Maybe Percy would find another solution by then. "I have to make a few concessions here and there. I'll never reach godhood if I let opportunities like this slip by," he reminded himself. "Greetings, ladies and gentlemen," a booming voice said, breaking Percy out of his thoughts. The speaker was an elderly wight who stood at the center of the arena, though the sound was clearly amplified and projected by countless enchantments all over the stadium. Judging by his gold-trimmed tunic, this person was either the master of an influential sect, or somebody powerful enough to compete for such a position. "As you all know, we are here today to watch the 5th block of the preliminary rounds of the 6th Region's 356,432nd annual tournament. The rules are the same as always, so I won't bore you with them. That said, one thing is very different this year. Our esteemed sponsor, the Ancestral Lineage Sect, has made a generous contribution to the tournament's prize pool." The wight paused for a moment as hushed murmurs spread through the stadium, among both contestants and spectators. Casrith also seemed taken aback by the announcement, flicking his forked tongue with unconcealed greed. Percy was about to ask his host what the commotion was for when the sect master spoke again. "Many of you seem to have guessed it already," he chuckled. "This isn't the first time one of our patrons graces our competition. Our world's leading sects often reward our most promising disciples with powerful techniques and unique treasures. Nevertheless, this is a special occasion, because the ancestral lineage sex contribution is a very costly one. Naturally, there aren't enough portions for all of today's participants, so the primary ingredient for the ritual can only be selected from the prize pool after winning the third round. That said, the secondary ingredients can still be claimed earlier. One per round. Thus, our contestants are welcome to begin accumulating them from the start if they feel confident in reaching the top 32. The old mage let his words linger once again, mostly for dramatic effect, before continuing. In summary, a few of our most talented young men and women have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to greatly and permanently enhance their physique. Two blues fought above the arena, giant balls of molten lava splashing frequently on the translucent barrier shielding the spectators, before rolling harmlessly down its smooth surface. The scorching liquid pooled at the edges of the arena, inconveniencing the other blues waiting there for their own battles. Most of them used their domains to protect themselves from the substance, though one of the elite disciples seemed entirely unbothered, almost as if he could tell in advance that the composite mana wasn't going to end up anywhere near him. Percy and Kassereth were also standing in that crowd, holding the magma at bay with a wall of willpower. Perhaps, it would have been more prudent of them to spend this time either watching the cataclysmic battle taking place above their heads or observing the other contestants around them, trying to gauge the strength of their soon-to-be opponents. Neither of them was interested in doing that, however, their minds still occupied by the sect leader's words. Kassereth in particular had practically been drooling since the revelation. Percy couldn't really blame his host for that either, since he could also tell that this body tempering thing had to be something good. Enhancing your physique? How does that even work? He asked, though he tried to contain his excitement. No matter what this reward did, Percy didn't know if it could be used by a human. Kassereth frowned upon hearing his question, apparently having forgotten for a moment that he was sharing his body with another. A wave of apprehension rippled through his soul as he hesitated to respond. Really? Percy rolled their eyes at his host's reaction. Need I remind you that you wouldn't even be participating in the tournament if not for me? Or do you suddenly think you can get through 3 rounds without my help? Kassereth sighed. I want to keep the resources if we make it that far. Don't forget that it's my body and core that give us most of our strength. Even your domain and runes wouldn't be possible without my grade and affinity. Why don't you just get the hell out of here? Isn't that what you came here for in the first place? A pang of sardonic laughter escaped Percy's wisp as he listened to his host's sheer audacity. He was tempted to say something harsh, but he held himself back. Arguing with the bastard right before the tournament wouldn't benefit either of them. Look, the White said we can only get the main ingredient for the ritual after the 3rd round, but he didn't say we're only allowed one. We need to win 4 times anyway to get to the leaf, so we might both be able to get a portion. Kassereth didn't reply immediately, seemingly contemplating Percy's words. I suppose that may be possible, he conceded, if somewhat unwillingly. But that would mean giving up on the other rewards. The ritual isn't the only valuable thing in the prize pool. And we'll need 2 sets of secondary ingredients too, if we want the complete version of the ritual. Complete version? How does it differ from the regular? Percy asked, realizing that this ancestral lineage sect was quite famous among Thescalans, even though this ritual of theirs was supposedly difficult to come by. The base version only strengthens our body, but there are 2 optional modifications. The first also sharpens our thermal vision and improves our resistance to heat and cold. The second increases the potency of our venom and our body's resistance to toxins. Percy creased his brow upon hearing that. These traits sounded an awful lot like something one would find in a beast's body, not a sapient's. Then again, this wasn't news to him. The fact that his host possessed tools like venom or thermal vision had struck him as odd ever since he found himself on Thescala. I know what you are thinking, Kassereth said upon noticing his confusion. You're not wrong. These physical traits are things we have inherited from our beast ancestors. Like most sapients in the universe, losing our beast affinities has gradually caused our bodies to weaken. With every generation, our venom grows less potent and our senses duller. At least, This was the case until the ancestral lineage sect came along with their special bloodline. A bloodline, of course. This story has been stolen from Royal Road. If you read it on Amazon, please report it. Whenever an entire group of people developed some weird ability that they had no business possessing, it was often the result of either a decree or someone's bloodline. And since bloodlines were brought about thanks to a decree, it all came down to the number of gods and titans a world possessed. Both were things a greater spring had in spades. But Percy didn't interrupt his host, waiting for the rest of Casrith's explanation. At first, their bloodline appeared useless. It did slow down the degradation of their ancestral abilities, yet the effect was subtle, and their physique had already weakened greatly by then. Eventually, they invented a ritual to preserve the potency of their blood even after death, allowing them to pass it to their disciples. After generations of repeated usage, they managed to recover a fraction of their body's latent power, giving birth to the greater Thescalan physique. It still isn't as good as the original, nor does it scale as well with one's grade, but it's far better than what should be possible without a beast affinity. Percy rubbed his borrowed chin thoughtfully. It was a great reward, though that still didn't tell him whether a non-Thescalan could undergo the ritual. As a human, Percy possessed neither venom of his own, nor the ability to sense the temperature of his surroundings. Perhaps, his species had their own set of long-forgotten abilities, lying dormant within their blood, but it remained a question whether this ritual could awaken any of them. Then again, it might not be impossible for him to acquire at least a part of the Thescalan physique. Based on what Casrith said, the ritual didn't necessarily depend on the recipient as much as it did on the person passing their lineage to another. Why would they share something this valuable with outsiders, though? Percy asked, thinking of a different problem. Casrith shrugged. Mostly for selfish reasons. Someone with a strengthened physique can pass it to their offspring even without the bloodline or the ritual. If done that way, the lineage will inevitably start degrading again, but it takes many generations to weaken. It's in the sect's best interest to spread their lineage across Thescala every few centuries, to raise the average quality of our blood. A rising tide lifts all boats, and all that. After all, they recruit new members from outside the sect, like everyone does, so they don't want their new disciples' physiques to have a low starting point. Also, the elite disciples who rank at the top of these tournaments are some of our most promising candidates to become gods in the future. Stronger gods help Thescala rise in the cosmic hierarchy. Percy nodded, not disagreeing with any of that, though he couldn't help but latch on to something his host had said. Every couple of centuries? And you're telling me I was lucky enough that this happened right when I joined the tournament? He asked, finding this difficult to believe. Casrith shook his head, however. I think you are forgetting where you are. This is a greater spring, not the average barren shithole you visit on your travels. The ritual is certainly a great opportunity, but it's far from the only valuable reward to find its way into the competition. Despite what the announcer said to spur the crowd's excitement, there's something just as good almost every time. Last year, the Enchanted Scale sect offered a chance to have a demigod personally inscribe every scale on one's body with an enchantment of their choosing. 4 years ago, the Profound Alchemic Institute offered a free 30-year tuition to their academy. Keep in mind that they don't usually let outsiders join for no amount of money, and they're one of Thescala's leading alchemist organizations. Percy's eyes widened as he realized just how many amazing opportunities were available on Thescala every year. Perhaps having the chance to compete for this ritual that might or might not even do anything positive to his body wasn't quite the lucky break he thought it was. In fact, spending 3 decades studying alchemy on a greater spring might have been a far better reward for him, if somewhat time-consuming. Alas, there was no point lamenting on what wasn't meant to be. Okay, how about this? We'll take turns picking rewards from the prize pool, assuming we keep winning, of course. Keep in mind that I could have just blackmailed you into giving me everything, but I'd rather we both have a mutual interest to not try and sabotage each other. I'll even give you the first pick. How magnanimous of you! Casrith laughed, the bastard having the gall to employ sarcasm even as Percy extended an olive branch. Are you planning to go for the ritual too? I don't know, Percy said. It's great if it works on me, but I'm not sure I want to waste 3 rewards on an unknown. I suppose I'll have to browse through the rest of the options and see if there's anything better for me. In any case, they'd have to win a total of 6 rounds to earn enough ingredients for 2 complete rituals. That was already enough to get them to the semifinals, which would be even harder than earning Percy's life-extending leaf. Then again, that was only true if they picked all the optional modifications. If they each forsook one, they could have enough ingredients for the ritual by the time they made the top 16. Since Percy didn't even have thermal vision or venom of his own, he would rather prioritize strengthening his body. If it worked, it might let him draw some more power out of the carnival, and maybe even use it alongside the yellow Troll's Fury tattoos he was planning to give himself as soon as he registered the compression principle. As things stood, the orange version of the ink barely did anything, and he wasn't sure his body could handle both his boosting art and a tattoo matching his grade. Ahem. Number 53. Please step onto the arena, the white announcer said, sounding irritated. Only then did Percy realize that the previous battle had ended, and everyone was staring at his host, or more specifically, at the circular plate with the number 53 written on it. It was finally their turn. Percy and his host had decided to try and keep the second domain and the enchanted sword secret for as long as they could. Khasrith's all-out attack wasn't that hard to avoid once their opponent knew it was coming, so they understood they couldn't keep relying on it. Still, they hoped it would be enough to at least get them through the first fight. It was an ambitious, if somewhat risky, strategy. Sadly, things didn't go according to plan. As soon as the announcer declared the start of the battle, their opponent began to release large volumes of pink mist from her body, instantly lowering visibility in the arena. At first, Percy thought that it wouldn't affect them too much. Between their thermal sense and mana sense, they should have all the tools they needed to see right through the substance. He couldn't have been more wrong. Within seconds, it became apparent that the mist was boiling hot, greatly affecting Khasrith's ability to lock onto the woman's body heat. Even worse, the substance was dense with blue mana, making their opponent all but invisible. What even is this? It can't be a steam affinity, can it? Steam mana, the very same that Femel, the holy child that Elaine had killed inside the Thirsty Valley, had wielded, was the fusion of fire and water. Among all the common, composite, and rare affinities Percy had ever heard of, it was the closest match to the woman's mist. Still, he had no explanation for its strange color. Did the woman possess a blessing too on top of having a composite affinity? Under other circumstances, running into somebody this talented would have been unthinkable. Then again, Percy didn't forget where he was or who he was facing. These elite disciples were among the best mages a Greater Spring had to offer. However, it soon became clear that his initial assessment wasn't entirely correct. The moment the substance reached Khasrith's nostrils, a wave of dizziness slammed into their head, almost knocking them off the flying great sword. Percy's host was forced to climb even higher in search of clean air. He even summoned a handful of spinning longswords by his side to keep the toxic gas away. It's poison, the blue guessed. But it's not the corrosive kind you'd get from an acid affinity. I bet it's the result of a bloodline rather than an affinity or a blessing. She mixes it into her steam to knock her opponents out. The good news was that its effect didn't seem that potent. They probably had Khasrith's innate resistance to toxins to thank for that. Had it been a human blue facing the woman, they might have passed out already. However, that didn't mean that Percy and his host could afford to breathe the substance for an extended period of time with no repercussions. Having to keep their distance from the mist was just the start of their trouble. Khasrith's all-out attack could only be unleashed once, and would leave them vulnerable afterwards. They had to make sure they located the woman before firing it, but she had hidden herself well inside the mist. Finding her was becoming even harder by the second as the substance kept accumulating in the arena, the thick plume of scorching poison slowly rising toward them. Their opponent appeared more than happy to wait. She hadn't made any other moves. She merely released her corrupted mana at a leisurely and, most importantly, sustainable pace, slowly increasing her advantage. "Any ideas?" Khasrith asked. Percy didn't immediately respond. They could hurl weaker spells at her and hope they got lucky, But even a blue with low mobility wouldn't have much trouble dodging a bunch of isolated and unfocused attacks like that. The only thing they would achieve would be to deplete their mana faster than her. The best approach would probably be to push their domain to the floor of the arena and use it to funnel the mist away. Not only would that get rid of the poison, it would allow them to locate their target. The problem was that the woman clearly knew what she was doing. Percy wouldn't be surprised if she had trained herself in fighting like this her whole life. Maybe she didn't participate in a tournament every day, but she was likely used to ambushing her opponents in enclosed spaces where they couldn't get rid of her poison. Since the very start of the battle, she'd been fighting against Khasrith's domain with her own, protecting her advantage. She even seemed to know how to shape it so that they couldn't tell which way it was emanating from as she moved silently around the battlefield. "I've got nothing, not unless we want to reveal our trump cards earlier than planned," Percy ultimately said. If he piled his domain on top of his hosts, they would quickly overpower their opponents, forcing her out of hiding. Alternatively, his sharpness and lightness runes would improve both the potency and the speed of Khasrith's attacks without adding to their mana cost, allowing them to hit her more easily or even win in a battle of attrition. That said, they didn't want to concede one of their future advantages so early into the tournament. Their opponents would only grow stronger the farther they progressed, so they had to get used to winning under unfavorable conditions. Khasrith clicked his tongue. What's her goal anyway? She doesn't seem to be in a rush to attack. Listening to his host's question, Percy couldn't help but crease his brow. Right? Is she planning to outlast us? As far as he could tell, the tournament's battles didn't have a time limit. They could potentially go on for days, since blues could stay awake and even fight for a long time. However, Khasrith would have to land somewhere eventually. Flying atop his greatsword didn't consume much mana, but keeping it airborne for hours on end was mentally taxing. What the woman was doing with her mana and her own domain wasn't costless either, but she was probably used to fighting like this. This tale has been pilfered from Novelbin. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. Was she betting on them passing out from exhaustion before she did? It certainly made sense, since Khasrith wasn't allowed to touch down anywhere outside the arena. If he grew tired first, his only option would be to fall into her trap. What an insidious way to fight, Khasrith said, though he didn't sound very annoyed. If anything, the realization seemed to have put him at ease. It was a good strategy, one that neither the spectators who had come here for entertainment, nor the other contestants waiting patiently for their own fights would appreciate. It would have likely worked on almost anyone else. It wasn't against the rules either, nor did the woman seem to give a shit what anybody thought. Unfortunately for her, they couldn't have matched her with a worse opponent. Percy grinned. Never thought I'd find myself challenged to a staying awake contest. Let's see which one of us lasts the longest. Hours passed, with the two combatants doing nothing but stabilizing their dominion over their side of the battlefield. The pink mist was thickest near the floor of the arena, but it had slowly risen higher. Still, there was a limit to how high the wall of poison could reach without scattering. Once it surpassed the invisible barrier protecting the spectators, it had nothing to box it in. The gas wanted to spread in all sorts of random directions, and the woman's domain wasn't strong enough to hold it in place that far away from her body. Certainly not while fighting off Khasrith's. As for the latter, he just had to stay afloat a few dozen meters above the floor and make sure that the substance never reached him again. The crowd booed as they watched this most boring battle unfold, or rather, refuse to unfold. Even the other contestants seemed to join in at some point, cursing at the woman's 20 generations of ancestors for giving birth to such an annoying mage. Percy and Khasrith didn't care in the slightest about any of that, however, knowing full well that they had this one in the bag. Instead, they talked about other things to pass the time. "I've noticed that many of your people have composite affinities," Percy said at some point. Other than Khasrith and his current opponent, there was also the lava user from the previous battle, and an ice mage who had participated 3 fights earlier. Given the fact that they were dealing with elite disciples, some special affinities were only to be expected. Still, rare affinities were supposed to emerge at similar rates to composite ones, yet Percy hadn't seen as many of those on Theskala. It was either a huge coincidence or something else was going on. Most of them are acquired, Kasrith said, before elaborating. Mine is innate. I inherited it from my mother. But a lot of the people you'll meet in this tournament started off with a common affinity and got it upgraded using some rare treasure. Percy perked up at the sound of that. He'd thought that resources like the lotus of a myriad rivers which had caused such a stir on Remir were hard to come by. That didn't seem to apply to a greater spring. Do you think there will be any such treasures in the reward pool? Probably, Kasrith shrugged. Don't expect to find one that can grant a rare affinity though. They do exist, but they're extremely difficult to find, even for the strongest worlds. Percy couldn't help but sigh in disappointment. He might have chosen not to change his pure affinity to a common one, but he was still holding out for something better. A life affinity which he knew would pair well with his bloodline would be ideal, but he wouldn't have said no to something like time or space either. Well, I suppose that a composite affinity is still on the table if I grab a couple of different treasures, he reminded himself. Percy was admittedly a little envious of his familiar for having 2 extra sets of mana channels and so many options to choose from during a fight. Perhaps, if he could obtain petals capable of granting an earth and a lightning affinity, he could consume them both to get a metal one like Kasrith. It would be just as good for runecrafting as his pure mana, if not better in some ways. There was a good chance he would be able to fuse it with his soul mana to produce a phantom variant too. The only thing he wasn't sure about was whether it could be spun into some kind of silk for him to use with his trait. As for the cyan powder that he needed for the Aurora Dew, it was no longer even a concern. Percy could use his spirit-forged effigy to swiftly produce enough crystallized mana to last for decades, or even centuries, before changing his affinity. Even storage wouldn't be an issue, since he had more empty spatial amulets than he knew what to do with. Then again, this might not be the best idea. A metal affinity would definitely be a lot more suitable for him than water, but it might be best to wait, just in case he found something even better down the line. Let's see what they have first. No sense in worrying about this now. Maybe I can pick something for Nesha or Elaine instead. Percy fully intended to prioritize himself, of course. Not only that, but he would rather pick things exclusive to Thescala if he could help it. The rest he could find elsewhere, since he hoped and expected to visit more greater springs in the future. That said, 8 rewards were plenty, assuming that he and Kasrith made it to the very end of the tournament, and Percy would be keeping half of them according to their agreement. He wouldn't rule out the possibility of choosing 1 or 2 for his friends. Are you planning to stay up there forever? A female voice suddenly asked, piercing through the pink mist. Depends, Kasrith replied with a chuckle. Are you going to withdraw your poison and fight me properly? The response wasn't immediate. I can do this longer than you, the woman eventually shouted, though the unease in her voice betrayed her inner doubt. Then shut up and keep pumping out mana, Kasrith said. This was probably the first time since Percy arrived on Thescala that he didn't disapprove of his host's snarky remarks, the woman having somehow managed to make herself even more annoying than Kasrith. Eventually, the sun set, the film of clouds above everyone's heads getting darker as a result. The crowd grew quieter too, probably getting sick of booing for so many hours. Some still shouted every now and then, while many had chosen to leave the stadium altogether. Perhaps they planned to return a couple of days later, once the match was over. Or maybe not even then, having decided the event wasn't their cup of tea. Most had remained, however, resigning themselves to waiting patiently for the frustrating fight to end. The sun rose and then set again, and again. By the 4th day, Percy and Kasrith felt quite tired. Their core burned from overuse, as even the slow trickle of mana keeping the great sword afloat had begun to take its toll. Their head pounded like crazy. Even though the insomnia trait had eliminated their need for sleep, it couldn't help them keep their domains deployed for days on end. At least, they cheated somewhat, taking turns to push against their opponent's willpower. They couldn't stack their domains without revealing their secret weapon, but nothing stopped them from using them one at a time. All things considered, the fight wasn't going great for them, but they knew the woman couldn't be having a good time either. She also had to constantly release the poison steam, and she had nobody to help her keep her domain active. nor did she possess a spectral trait to prevent her eyelids from drooping. It was just a matter of time before she collapsed. It had to be. Sure enough, the woman seemed to finally realize that this was a lost cause on the 5th day. The flow of mist stopped early in the afternoon, her domain receding as she spoke. "Fine, you prick. I guess you want to win this more badly than I do. I surrender." Percy and Kasserith watched in silence as their opponent slithered off the stage, her defeat already being swept away by the crowd's reaction. Only now, after having fought the woman for several mind-numbing days, did Percy bother to study her appearance. He had no idea what passed for beauty among the Thescalans, but he could admit the woman had a certain elegance to her. Her frame was lithe and willowy, her movements fluid in a way that reminded him of a wind chime drifting through water. Her tunic hung open at the front, as was common among the people of her race, leaving her narrow, scaled chest exposed. Thescalans didn't nurse their young, so they lacked certain body parts that one would see in a human. But cultural peculiarities like that barely registered with Percy anymore, especially when he had other things to worry about. "You know, we could have ended this a lot sooner if I hadn't wasted all of my soul mana to stitch your injuries up," he said with a mental sigh. While the woman's poison steam had concealed her from Kasserith's thermal sense and mana sense, Percy was certain he would have spotted her in an instant via soul vision. Then again, he didn't necessarily regret how the battle had gone. The past 5 days had been a complete slog, but he wasn't going to complain about what had essentially been a free, almost effortless victory. He and his host hadn't even been forced to reveal any of their trump cards, getting through the first round solely thanks to the insomnia trait. Fortunately, the female disciple hadn't had any noteworthy abilities outside of her irritating strategy of zoning her opponents out and waiting for them to grow tired. Not that she needed much else. Percy could absolutely see the pink mist knocking most of the other contestants out. Catching the woman was almost impossible while she hid within her domain, and her low mana expenditure allowed her to maintain her trap for a very long time. Just not long enough to take somebody like Percy down. He wouldn't be surprised if even Violets had fallen prey to her tactics in the past. This was clearly how she'd earned her status as an elite disciple in the first place, as well as a ticket to the tournament. "Well, whatever," Percy muttered, watching her tail vanish behind the edge of the platform. "Let's just grab our reward and chill until the next round." Kasserith gave a silent nod, descending slowly. As soon as he stepped on solid ground for the first time in days, he tossed his greatsword aside, letting it clatter to the floor unceremoniously. Traces of poisoned mist still lingered in the arena, a sluggish cloud that coiled near the ground like lazy smoke. Each breath brought a faint dizziness, but the substance was dissipating rapidly without its owner to replenish or hold it in place. The white announcer helped the process along, using his domain to fan the toxic fumes away, preparing the stage for the next pair of fighters. The crowd erupted in cheers as Kasserith slithered out of the arena. There were fewer people in the stadium than there had been at the start of the tournament, and most of them had fallen asleep during the fight, many of them multiple times. The commotion quickly woke everyone up, however, causing them to join the celebration. Percy didn't blame them for getting so excited. Granted, his host was just a newcomer to the tournament, so nobody had known him before the fight. The crowd would likely turn against him as early as during his next match, especially if he found himself fighting against one of the favorites. Still, today he'd done everyone a great favor. His battle against the woman might have not been the most enjoyable, but he'd at least eliminated her early on in the competition, sparing the audience from wanting to gouge their eyeballs out once in each round of the event. Even the organizers seemed to share that view. It was with great enthusiasm that a Violet Thescalan, a man with just a regular, untrimmed tunic, led Kasserith out of the stadium and down into one of the first caves lining the outer walls of the pillar-like structure. The place was dim and damp, filled with the steady, delicate sounds of dripping water. Droplets fell from jagged stalactites overhead, echoing softly as they struck shallow puddles of various shapes scattered across the uneven floor. This book's true home is on another platform. Check it out there for the real experience. Despite its almost primitive atmosphere, the place was anything but natural. Runes glowed along the walls in orderly lines, clear, deliberate signs of an advanced civilization, painting a stark contrast against the backdrop of moss-covered stone. The Broken Fong sect had been like this too, though Percy hadn't paid much attention at the time, thinking it had just been a peculiarity of that place. I suppose their species like their environments dark and humid, he reasoned. The Violet Guide remained silent until they reached a wide intersection. The tunnel forked into 3 different paths, each marked by a glowing sign engraved into the floor. Beyond the arches, Percy could make out shelves carved directly into the cavern walls, each lined with countless colorful orbs that glowed softly. "This is the treasury for the first round," the guide explained, turning to face them at last. "Most of these rewards will remain available in future rounds, unless of course they are in limited supply and somebody claims them first. But more and better prizes will be added as you progress through the tournament." Kassereth flicked his tongue curiously. "So I can pick anything I want from this level?" "Indeed," the guide confirmed, handing over a bronze badge covered in runes. "Take your time. You may enter and leave the chambers freely. Placing your hand against the enchantments on the shelves will show you a detailed description of the items. When you've made your choice, press the badge to the runes instead to claim your prize. I'll be outside." Without even waiting for a response, the man turned and slithered away, leaving them alone. Percy found it strange that the Violet hadn't stuck around to supervise them. Their enchantments are probably designed to prevent theft. Maybe Metatron's spatial seal could bypass those protections? But Percy wasn't going to count on that. He didn't doubt that the Thescalan safeguards were mere toys before the Titan's skill, but Metatron hadn't exactly poured much effort into crafting the artifact. And even if the seal could circumvent the enchantments, Percy wasn't sure he wanted to test it. Stealing from people who'd done nothing wrong didn't sit well with him. He generally tried to leave the places he visited better than he found them. At the same time, he wouldn't rule out the possibility of snatching a treasure he liked, provided that he could leave something equally valuable in its place as compensation. Still, he wasn't in a hurry to try that. For now, he wanted to do things properly. The more battles he and Kassereth won, the more rewards he could claim legitimately. No sense in blowing the opportunity on a gamble. "Shall we?" Kassereth asked, breaking Percy from his thoughts. "Go on. It's your pick," Percy replied, already regretting offering his slimy host the first reward. With a sigh, he added, "Just do me a favor and go through everything first, yeah? I want to see what kind of stuff they've got." The blue snorted in amusement. "I was going to do that anyway. Gawking at the prizes is half the fun." Not wasting another moment, Kassereth entered the leftmost tunnel, labeled Equipment. He ignored the first few orbs, his gaze eventually lingering on one that shimmered in an indigo color, clearly an indication that it was compatible with his lightning affinity. Following the guide's instructions, the Thescalan placed his palm on the rune next to the glowing sphere, causing a foreign whisper, soft like a serpent's hiss, to sound within their shared mind. Undersir. Thunderbone Javelin. Material, Lacarian Femur, blue. The mana type, Lightning, clear. Enchantments, Thrice Amplified Preservation, Thrice Amplified Hardness, Thrice Amplified Lightning Resonance, Remote Control. Description: crafted from the femur of a male, blue Lacarian bred by the Osto Procurement Department of the Bioacquisition Conglomerate. Enchanted by Genserath, ancestor of the Heavenly Tribulation sect, and donated to the tournament. The artifact can withstand frequent violet-grade combat for up to a decade. Optimized for use with long-ranged, lightning affinity, piercing spells. Overall grade, violet. Undersir. A dozen questions surged through Percy's mind as he listened to the item's description. There was a lot to unpack, since this was his first time coming across an enchanted weapon designed for combat, aside from those he had personally crafted. But one important, if somewhat irrelevant detail stood out. "Clear? Is that what the grade above white is called?" Kassereth nodded. Demigod and Ancestor are unofficial terms. Once a mage reaches the clear grade, their mana becomes pure enough that it's almost transparent to a mortal's mana sense. Only gods and demigods have senses sharp enough to spot it with ease. It's also dense like a liquid even in its unmanifested state, and can be stored for an extended period of time outside one's body. Percy couldn't help but crease his brow. This sounded an awful lot like divine mana, the thick fluid he had absorbed during his evaluation in Phoebe's temple, or the substance he received from the vault every time he repaired the Morais decree for one of his hosts. Does it become even denser after a demigod ascends to godhood? He asked. His host shook his head. Demigods wield the same grade of mana as gods. That's actually why they're called demigods in the first place. One of the primary goals during the entirety of the color realm is to gradually improve the grade of one's core all the way from red to clear, one step at a time, all in preparation for attaining divinity. Color realm? That's the official term for mortals, I take it. Indeed. Once you become a god, you cross over to the concept realm. Your power is no longer determined by the color of your core, but by the number of concepts you have mastered. But don't let the fact that gods possess the same grade of mana as demigods fool you into thinking that the difference between the two realms is small. That couldn't be farther from the truth. A god's internal world contains dozens, if not hundreds, of times more mana than a mortal's core, and the way they wield it is fundamentally different. The gulf separating the two realms is generally considered as vast as that between three mortal grades. Percy swallowed hard. Leaving aside the other valuable information his host had shared, this was his first time hearing the gap between mortals and deities so clearly quantified. He'd always known that gods were far stronger, but the difference was even greater than he had imagined. 3 grades. On Remir, the most talented mages struggled to fight a single grade above their own. Even on a greater spring like Thescala, that was the most one could hope to achieve. All who managed it were granted a distinct status and venerated as the pride of their world, participating in grand tournaments for all to watch and showered with priceless treasures year after year. Had somebody told them that Percy regularly fought and defeated multiple blues as a mere yellow, they would have lost their minds. Yet, even he didn't think he was ready to challenge violets. No wonder the ancestors don't get a trim. No matter what they do, they'll never compete against actual gods, he thought, recalling Kasrith's earlier words. It wasn't that strange they spent most of their time in seclusion, trying to attain divinity, either. Percy could absolutely understand the temptation. After all, demigods were just a step away from their goal. It was a promotion that didn't depend on centuries or millennia of guzzling down elixirs, but merely a realization. A singular obstacle standing between their, admittedly long, but still finite lives and true immortality. Becoming gods would grant them the greatest boost in power a living being could ever experience. Yeah, I think I'd lose myself in training too if I was in their shoes. Alas, Percy was still a long way from having to worry about such things. Turning his attention back to the matter at hand, he realized his host had already moved past the bone javelin, examining other pieces of equipment of similar quality. The enchanted weapons weren't bad. Most of them could exhibit violet-level strength if used the right way, while having been crafted out of merely blue materials. Strictly speaking, this was a similar dynamic to what Percy did. He had forged everything out of yellow mana but enchanted his weapons and armor to be on par with a green's constructs. The only reason he was able to use them to fight blues was due to how easily he could duplicate and control them from afar, as well as the creative ways in which he wielded them. The difference is that I do everything myself, he reminded himself. These people need a demigod to elevate blue materials to violet-quality equipment. Even so, the right tools could still make a difference if Kasrith used them against elite disciples. They would be even more impactful for Percy, who only fought regular blues on Remir, assuming he found an artifact compatible with his affinity. Sadly, Kasrith wasn't allowed to use any of these things in the tournament. They were rewards he was expected to keep afterwards. Percy didn't like depending on external items either. A powerful weapon might be able to help him right now, but it would turn into a useless lump of metal as soon as he advanced. He would much rather claim rewards that permanently increased his strength, even if their immediate impact was lower. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. That said, the two still took their sweet time browsing through the shelves, examining anything that caught their eye. For Percy, it was a valuable opportunity to study the methods of actual demigods from a greater spring, giving him new ideas on how to improve his craft, or on what types of runes to purchase the next time he visited the vault. Even Casrith seemed to enjoy this. This was obviously his first time participating in the tournament, so he'd likely never even seen so much quality equipment gathered in a single place. It wasn't just weapons they found in the room. There was also a lot of protective gear, and even tools of convenience, like an enchanted flask that could produce drinking water while being fueled by almost any common affinity, except fire. Its efficiency was terrible, but that didn't make it any less useful for a powerful mage who frequently traveled alone. They even saw a map of Thescala that could pinpoint and mark its own location in real time in the form of a blinking dot. Percy found everything fascinating, but there were very few items that he was genuinely tempted to pick. Most notable was a pendant enchanted by an ancestor with a time affinity. Its effect was subtle and rather niche, yet it held a unique appeal for Percy. It could only be fueled by certain mana types, but pure mana was luckily among them. While active, its enchantments slowed down the passage of time for its wearer by a modest 10%, essentially giving it the opposite function to the Thirsty Valley or the Wiseman's Chamber. That might not sound all that impressive. The effect was downright detrimental in many cases, since it would slow down the person's advancement speed and their ability to react to dangers in their surroundings. However, Percy knew it could be very useful for him, due to the way his clones worked. If he slowed his main body down for the rest of his life, his clones would effectively get a few extra centuries of traveling, allowing them to find more opportunities and treasures to bring back to Remir. It wasn't a lot, but those extra adventures could end up making the difference between Percy attaining godhood or dying of old age as a mortal. Sadly, I can't really use it right now. Percy was currently on the run, hunted by some of the most powerful noble houses on Remir. He had to keep increasing his strength as quickly as possible, which was precisely why he'd chosen to sacrifice over a decade of opportunities to train inside Kronos' decree. Besides, the pendant wouldn't even last very long. According to its description, it was only expected to remain functional for 5 to 10 years, and Percy wouldn't have any way to repair or replace it without the correct materials or time mana. With a heavy heart, he watched his host move to the next room. As interesting as the enchanted items were, it wasn't what they'd come here for. The second chamber was labeled property. Percy thought the category sounded a little odd, having no idea what to expect. Nevertheless, Casrith entered the room enthusiastically, much more so than the last one. Not wasting any time, the Thescalan placed his palm on one of the enchantments, examining the first item on the shelf. Undersir. Gisari Town. Location: Rathlin Archipelago, Fermani Sea, North Hemisphere. Population: 407. Distribution: 48 Yellowborns, 115 Orangeborns, 244 Redborns. Military strength: 3 blues, 15 greens. The notable features: elastic body bloodline, 34 males, 41 females. Iron Fang bloodline, 7 males, 3 females. Space affinity, 2 males, 1 female. Gravity affinity, 1 female. No overlap. Neighboring organizations: Iron Fang Sect, Burning Glory Sect. Undersir. You can claim ownership of a whole town? Just like that? Percy asked, dumbfounded. Of course. The people who enter this room are all elite disciples or grand elders. The whole planet essentially belongs to people like us. This is one of the best ways to find suitable servants or mating partners to build our dynasties with. Casrith replied with a shrug, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. What about the people living there? Don't they get a say? Percy asked again, his host's silence giving him his answer. Seeing the blues' nonchalance, Percy suddenly felt a lot better about the possibility of robbing this place clean. It appeared that Casrith was far from the only scumbag on Thescala. Sure, the way noble houses on Remir governed over their provinces and towns wasn't all that different, but at least the commoners typically spent centuries under the same family's control. They weren't passed around from individual to individual on a whim like commodities. When nobles invited yellowborn commoners to their families, the latter were usually allowed to decline. It was an alluring offer for sure, but peasants were rarely forced into unwanted marriages. Evidently, Kasrith's people weren't as accommodating toward their weaker brethren. Why would anyone even claim this crap from the treasury? Leaving the morality of it aside, wouldn't they rather increase their own strength than waste their rewards on towns and servants? Percy asked again, the whole thing leaving a bad taste in his borrowed mouth. Are you kidding? These are some of the most popular rewards, Kasrith replied with a chuckle. Don't forget that the tournaments take place every year. The participants don't change nearly as frequently, so most of the elite disciples have many opportunities to pick what they want from the prize pool. As much as Percy hated to admit it, this made a lot of sense. Most of the other prizes were one-offs. Each blue only needed a couple of rewards at most to permanently upgrade their affinities, and only a few pieces of equipment per decade. Even if most of them only won a single round every couple of years, they'd quickly amass all of those things. Other than limited-time opportunities, like the ancestral lineage sex ritual that was being offered this year, there wasn't much else for the most successful participants to spend their rewards on. Even so, Percy didn't approve. Whatever. This is making my stomach churn. Just grab what you want from the last room and go. The third and final room was by far the smallest, but also the most interesting. It was labeled Personal Improvement, and it contained precisely the kinds of rewards Percy had come here for. There were only 2 shelves, the first one lined up with orbs of 5 different colors, treasures corresponding to the common affinities, no doubt. Their function was obvious, but Kasrith still placed his hand on one of the enchantments, the item's description soon confirming Percy's guess. Undersir. Wick of the Waning Flame. Defect. Breathe the smoke it releases while drawing mana to your core to acquire a fire affinity. May only be used by up to 11 people. Warning. Only suitable for pure and common affinity users. Duration, 55 days. Total, 8 days. Remaining. Uses, 11. Total, 3. Remaining. Undersir. There wasn't much there, but Percy still found the information fascinating. The artifact was similar to the Lotus of a Myriad Rivers in many ways. It could be used by multiple people, and it only lasted for a short time. 11 uses were much fewer than the 10,000 petals the Lotus had produced, yet it seemed that the wick could survive a bit longer. At the same time, most of its lifespan had been exhausted already, so whoever claimed it from the treasury would have to consume it promptly. If it's anything like the Lotus, I guess it's impossible to slow its decay down. Percy still had several questions. For one, this item wasn't a plant like the Lotus, making him wonder what the connection between the 2 treasures was. Even if they had both been plants, that wouldn't explain how they worked, not when most plants in the universe were simple living organisms stuck at orange or lower, without properties even remotely this interesting. Where do these artifacts come from? He couldn't help but ask. Most commonly, from the remains of dead gods. Kasrith replied in an even tone, making it seem as if he was discussing something as mundane as the weather, rather than sharing high-level secrets. Percy wasn't nearly as calm. On the other hand, his host's words throwing his wisp in turmoil. Probably sensing his surprise, the Thescalon continued with a smile. When a deity dies, their internal world collapses, creating a large concentration of divine mana mixed with potent willpower and concepts that have nowhere to go. It doesn't always give rise to artifacts like this wick, but the likelihood goes up the more powerful the god was, and the more concepts they had mastered. A greater spring like Thescala probably got involved in lots of interplanetary conflicts, so it wasn't that strange that their gods looted affinity-changing treasures from their fallen opponents so often. Thinking about it, Percy realized that it was precisely this phenomenon that Sverig must have based his decree on to create the Rings of Sacrilege. Somehow, the Mad Titan had found a way to preserve not just the basic concepts that could grant one a certain affinity, but even the more obscure ones that mortals could normally only inherit as blessings from their divine parents. Svarig's infamous ring mold had probably fashioned those concepts into objects that lasted forever and could be used by an infinite number of people. In other words, his creations had exceeded what the regular affinity-changing treasures were capable of in every conceivable way. No wonder they had sparked one of the greatest wars in the history of the universe. What about the rare affinities? Percy asked, latching onto something. You said those are very difficult to find. Casrith shrugged. Even if we ignore the fact that less than 1% of the population, and therefore gods, have a rare affinity, the corresponding treasures have more trouble forming, since the mana types don't resonate with the world as easily. Percy nodded, thinking back to his home world. Remir was rather lucky in the sense that they had produced a whopping 3 titans with rare affinities while having only given rise to 100 or so gods in total. Perhaps it wasn't that strange that mages with rare affinities were better positioned to attain divinity or invent a decree, but Percy still felt that his planet was an outlier in that regard. That said, even if somebody was to slaughter every god on Remir, there was no guarantee they would obtain a single artifact capable of granting a rare affinity. Even if they did, it might only be usable for a few days and by a handful of people. If that wasn't problematic enough, only those with pure affinities would even be eligible to use it. If Percy wanted a life affinity for his second core, he would have to hunt down multiple powerful gods who possessed that affinity and hope for the best. Even for peak worlds, this wasn't an easy thing to do. It was debatable whether it was even worth it, just to strengthen a bunch of mortals. Something still didn't add up, though. Based on what Hermes had said during his original transmission, the Divine Order had been well aware of how the Lotus worked even before they planted the seed, meaning that it hadn't been the first of its kind. These resources, do they come in standard forms? Percy asked. If you discover this tale on Amazon, be aware that it has been unlawfully taken from Novelbin. Please report it. Casrith creased his brow. Oh? This isn't your first time encountering one, is it? Did your backwater planet get lucky in the past? Percy didn't respond, not wanting to clue his host in about the Lotus. If it was indeed as rare as Percy thought it was, it might not be difficult for the Thescalans to pinpoint which lesser spring had obtained one recently, thus linking Percy to Remir. Seeing him refuse to answer, the Blue shrugged. They do. Divine mana tends to coalesce in very specific ways, usually determined by the exact combination of concepts involved. Sometimes it produces a plant. Other times it's a mineral or an inanimate object. Hell, even small critters have been reported in the past. Wicks of the waning flame usually come from mid-tier gods with fire affinities. If you want one that lasts longer or works on more people, you'll typically need to kill a stronger god. If you want both, then it takes someone even more powerful than that. Even treasures without a time limit exist, but they can still only be used by a finite number of people. Those are obviously more precious, since they can be stored in a warehouse for years. The most powerful sects keep some of those in their vaults to reward their most talented disciples with in case they can't get the right limited-time treasure when they need it. I imagine a few might be offered during the later rounds of the tournament. What about treasures that grant a composite affinity directly? Well, they exist. They are rarer than common affinities and more common than rare affinities, but they're kinda useless. The only advantage is that they can grant somebody with a pure affinity a composite one directly, so they only need to consume one resource instead of 2. Other than that, they just limit one's options, since they can't be used by somebody with an unrelated common affinity. Percy sighed, realizing the resources currently available to them weren't very useful for him. In theory, the time limit didn't matter much if he used the treasure immediately. Sadly, his main body was currently hiding on the uninhabited side of Remir, so he couldn't return to Twilight City or the Camelot province in the near future. Hell, 8 days were probably not even enough for him to get through the tournament or return to his main body, let alone bring the treasure to Nesha or Elaine. If he wanted to spend one of his rewards on the girls, his best bet would be to wait for one that lasted for several months at the very least. In fact, he still didn't know what the Wasp Familiar's second affinity would be, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a treasure at hand just in case. The exact affinity was also something to consider. Water would be useless for Elaine, and Nesha didn't need earth. That only left fire, air, or lightning. Of the 3, lightning was probably the best for his girlfriend, as metal mana was more suitable for runecrafting than lava or dust. It would also give Elaine the same acid affinity as Galahad, so the two could practice together. These are some high requirements, though. A lightning resource that will last for a minimum of 6 months and has at least 3 uses left. Even then, there was a risk it would be useless for the wasp if it awakened a lightning affinity on its own, but that was outside Percy's control. Regardless, he had to win his way through the tournament and hope they offered what he wanted by the finals. Otherwise, he'd have to make some concessions. Strictly speaking, it was in Remir's best interest for him to pick a treasure that could be used by the greatest number of people, instead of only thinking about himself and his friends. However, Percy wasn't currently in a position to worry about that. The last thing he needed was to give everyone another reason to hunt him down, or to cause another round of fighting between the noble families. They made their bed when they put a bounty on my head. If they want a fancy composite affinity, it'll have to wait until this whole mess is over. Oblivious to his thoughts, Casrith shifted his gaze to the bottom shelf, the one that contained the items they had come here for. There were only 2 types of glowing orbs on this shelf, housing the secondary ingredients meant for the optional modifications of the ritual. The Thescalan picked an orb that shone in a deep shade of sickly green. He was clearly looking forward to enhancing the potency of his venom more than he cared about sharpening his thermal sense. It wasn't what Percy would have prioritized, but he knew this wasn't his choice. Undersir. Conflux of 1,000 toxins. A description: contains venom harvested by hundreds of high-grade Thescalans, many of them possessing the greater Thescalan physique or powerful poison-related bloodlines. In addition, the vial contains hundreds of toxins from other sources, such as poisonous plants or venomous beasts. Each toxin has been cured separately and extensively by expert alchemists before being added into the mixture, to minimize its lethality and ensure it can be absorbed into one's body as safely as possible. Warning: do not consume directly. The substance is only intended for use as part of the ancestral lineage sex ritual. Undersir. The thought of exposing his body to a concoction this dangerous caused Percy to shudder, especially since he still didn't know whether the ritual would work for him. If I do go through with this, I have to make sure I have lots of yellow or even green healing potions ready, just in case. Casrith didn't share his concerns, however. He pressed the bronze badge against the enchantment, watching the glowing orb shatter into countless tiny motes of light, a small gemstone vial floating into his hand. Unfortunately, his spatial pin had been confiscated before the start of the tournament, so Casrith would have to ask for permission to store his reward there until the conclusion of the event. I can keep it for you if you want, Percy offered with a mental smirk. Go away, Casrith spat. I'd rather trust a Haslath. Hey, you are the one who tried to kick me out of your body before upholding your end of the bargain. Not me, Percy reminded his host. Your soul injuries are still stitched up, aren't they? We both know why you're keeping me alive. But if I give you that vial, something tells me I'll never see it again. The Blue replied with a scoff. Suit yourself. I hope you don't forget that next round is my pick though, or we'll have a problem. The two then left the dark cave, looking forward to their next opponent. Overall, Percy was happy with the rewards on offer. Granted, most of them weren't directly useful for him at the moment, for one reason or another, which was admittedly a little disappointing, considering that this was a greater spring. Still, between the 3 ingredients for the ritual and the affinity-changing treasure he hoped to find, there was plenty to get him excited. And that was without including the valuable core cleansing technique his host had already taught him, the rare opportunity to face off against 8 elite disciples, the valuable information Casrith had shared about gods and demigods, and, most importantly, the main thing he had come to Thescala for, the life-extending Leaf Sirnith had promised him. Only 3 more battles to earn it. Percy and Casrith found the guide waiting for them by the cave's entrance, right where he'd said he'd be. The Violet looked mildly displeased, probably because they'd taken their sweet time in the treasury. In their defense, he had told them to stay as long as they wanted, though he probably hadn't expected them to examine nearly every orb on the shelves. Well, it's our first time here. Excuse us for being curious, Percy thought with a mental shrug, not feeling even a hint of regret. Either way, the guide said nothing, merely leading them to a cavern on the side of the pillar, this one only containing a small room with a single bed. Normally, The second round of the tournament was supposed to commence the moment the first ended. Contestants weren't meant to rest until the third or fourth round. However, the organizers had decided to make an exception, giving Kasrith a few extra hours to recover, in consideration of the fact that his previous fight had lasted nearly a week. The spectators and the other participants wouldn't be thrilled to wait even longer, but it was only fair. Of course, Percy and his host didn't actually need to sleep, but they still pretended to, closing their eyes and relaxing their minds. It was tempting to dwell on the sweet rewards still waiting for them in the treasury, or the powerful opponents ahead, but Percy tried to shut it all out. Letting my excitement sabotage everything would be idiotic. In the end, the break felt far too short. The guide woke them after what Percy could have sworn were only a few minutes. Returning to the arena, he quickly noticed that only about half the competitors remained, which was only to be expected now that the first round of the tournament was over. However, he also recognized all the same faces as before, meaning that the organizers hadn't shuffled the participants between blocks yet. I guess we'll have to eliminate most of the people in the neighboring brackets first, before they bring the winners together for the finals. Percy didn't know how many elite disciples had registered for this regional tournament in total, but he doubted it was exactly 256. That meant some would either need to fight an extra round or skip one altogether. Both scenarios were acceptable. An extra match made winning harder, but likely came with another reward from the treasury. At least, Percy hoped the Thescalans were sensible and generous enough to structure the event like that. Regardless, Kasrith wasn't in either such group. According to what they'd been told during the sign-up, they'd only have to go through 8 rounds, in total 7 of them left. Realizing that everyone had been waiting for them, Percy cast the pointless thoughts aside, slithering to the center of the arena along with his host. There, they came face to face with a burly man Percy recognized, the lava user who'd fought right before them in the previous round. In hindsight, Percy regretted not paying more attention to that fight. At least we know his affinity, he told his host with a mental sigh, Kasrith echoing the sentiment. The white announcer didn't waste time declaring the start of the battle. Kasrith manifested a hastily forged greatsword, taking to the air. Their opponent had already started launching balls of molten stone, twice the size of watermelons. The glowing liquid that splashed from every missed hit quickly began pooling at the floor of the arena. Percy had to admit that the constructs had looked slower and clumsier from the outside. It was a different story entirely once he found himself on the receiving end. The scorching spheres flew deceptively fast given their density, and the lava user controlled their paths with a precision no earth mage should have been capable of. Luckily, Kasrith wasn't a slouch. Percy had trained alongside his host many times, but this was his first time seeing him push to his limits. The blue was more agile atop his metallic weapon than even the air mage Percy and Mickey had faced after leaving the valley, one of the fastest opponents they'd ever dealt with. The thick walls of domain-infused steel Kasrith manifested on a whim were also much harder to pierce than the defenses of the Earth Mage, who had forced Percy to develop his second parade. Kasrith was able to shift between offense and defense with greater ease than the Water Mage had. Unauthorized usage. This tale is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. Overall, Percy could say with confidence that none of the dozens of blues he had slain on Remir would have been a match for Kasrith. He and Mickey could currently take on 3 of them at a time, but even so, he wasn't confident they would win against the Thescalan. Sadly, that alone wasn't enough to make Kasrith into an elite disciple, a title that their opponent absolutely deserved. The lava mage fought aggressively, trying to drive them to a corner with precise, coordinated formations of liquid meteors. The extreme heat softened Kasrith's metallic shields, the first strike leaving a deep dent in each one, the follow-ups almost always ripping them apart like paper. Kasrith was allowed to fly outside the arena as long as he didn't land elsewhere. But so was his opponent, riding a relatively cold slab of stone atop a rolling carpet of magma. The burly mage pursued them across the sea of clouds and mist surrounding the stadium. Runic formations hovered nearby, likely transmitting the fight to the spectators. The lava mage was gaining ground, or rather air. and a difference in mana reserves that kept growing with every spell the two sides cast. Kasrith was struggling to keep up with a true violet-level opponent on his own, the burly man being nothing like that one-trick pony of a woman that they'd eliminated before. "Help me! I can't win this by myself." Percy sighed. This wasn't ideal, even though they had expected it. Left with no other choice, he tried to pitch in subtle ways, trying not to reveal Kasrith's secret advantages so early. Using his instantaneous imprint spell, he engraved runes onto his host's constructs, but did so by allowing his willpower to sink deep beneath the surface of the metal, thus hiding the symbols from plain view. It made it impossible for an outsider to pry into what he was doing, but Percy's clever trick wasn't without its cost. The extra hoops he had to go through severely impacted the quality of his enchantments. Percy only managed to plant a few hardness and force absorption runes into the shields, allowing them to last a little longer. Equipping the swords with some sharpness and lightness runes gave Kasrith a chance to launch a better counterattack, finally putting some pressure onto his opponent. Whenever his host was about to get hit, Percy even coated their body with an additional layer of willpower, easing the mental strain. There was only so much he could do without revealing their unusual advantages, but his contribution seemed to tilt the scales slightly. Before long, Kasrith stopped getting pushed back, placing the lava user on the defensive. "Try to keep a few good swords on the side. I'll help you prepare the finisher," Percy advised. It wasn't going to be easy, because the two blues were almost evenly matched, even with Percy's thumb on the scale. Still, Percy took control of some swords and had them float behind his host, slowly covering their interiors with more complex runes. Enchanting the constructs with the full unit cell that he intended to use later on in the tournament was out of the question. He didn't think he could insert too many of his runes inside the swords without compromising their structural integrity either. But he did what he could. "Now, go for it!" he exclaimed as soon as he felt they were ready. Kasrith didn't hesitate. They might not always see eye to eye, but the Thescalon probably trusted the potency of Percy's runes, having seen what they could do during their training. The blue added a few unruned stone swords into his formation, mostly to get rid of the excess earth mana in his body, before coating the rest in a torrent of lightning mana. Indigo bolts danced across the metal blades, turning them red-hot, then white. With little warning, he hurled everything at the lava mage, who clearly didn't expect such a bold all-out attack. That said, the burly man maintained his composure, grinning at what he clearly thought was a dumb move. Emptying over 2/3 of his reserves, the lava mage shrouded himself in a thick sphere of liquid rock, likely confident it would block the spell and leave Kasrith vulnerable afterwards. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have been wrong. Earth mana, and all its permutations, was excellent for defense. A blue's all-out attack would usually lose to an equally powerful barrier cast by an earth user. Unless, of course, the attacker wielded some extremely lethal rare affinity like space or soul. Sadly for the burly man, there was nothing normal about his circumstances. Even leaving aside the fact that Kasrith specialized in offense, his attacks packed more of a punch than usual right now. The enchanted swords reached the magma sphere in a flash due to their reduced weight, their edges screaming through the air like solid bolts of lightning. Their sharpened tips pierced through the liquid shell like hot knives through even hotter butter, the extreme heat threatening to melt them mid-flight. But many of them survived thanks in no small part to Percy's hardness runes. Kasrith and Percy held their shared breath, the result not immediately clear. Soon, the sphere began to dissolve, revealing their opponent. Most of the swords had been destroyed halfway through, several tons of liquid steel having been swept away by the flowing lava. Still, a few patches of rapidly cooling metal clung to the man's scales like silver flowers in full bloom. The man winced as some of the heat seeped through, but the constructs hadn't pierced his skin, nor had they scorched his flesh. Colorful runes covered him from head to tail, protecting him. These weren't from the Vault of Magic, nor had they been drawn by Percy. They had been written in the Thescalon runecrafting language, and the thick, potent mana coursing through them clearly hadn't been produced by a blue, or a violet, or a white, or even a demigod. They had come from the stadium itself, the handiwork of a god, saving the contestant from certain death. Casrith's second match was over. They had won. Percy and Casrith didn't spend too long in the treasury after their second victory. In fact, they didn't even bother to check the new additions in the equipment and property chambers, heading straight to the small room labeled Personal Improvement. A few new affinity-changing treasures with longer durations and higher quotas had been added to the top shelf, but still nothing Percy would even consider bringing home. Taking over his host's body, he placed Casrith's palm on an enchantment in front of one of the light blue spheres glowing on the bottom shelf, next to the sickly green type that they had claimed before. Abyssal moss. A description. An extremely rare yellow-grade plant with an ice affinity, harvested from the deepest trenches of the frozen sea near Thescala's North Pole. It can be used in alchemy to brew yellow-grade potions, but that is widely considered to be a waste of an otherwise priceless ingredient. It has been treated to delay its effects, allowing it to be absorbed gradually, lowering one's body temperature. If used in tandem with the correct ingredients, it can permanently raise one's resistance to both heat and cold, and sharpen their thermal perception. Warning: do not consume directly. The substance is only intended for use as part of the ancestral lineage sex ritual. And there it was, the first of the 3 ingredients Percy wanted to claim above everything else from the prize pool. If he and his host failed to win enough battles, he could do without the toxins, but the abyssal moss in particular was something he had a use for. Outside of strengthening his body through the ritual, to hopefully improve his ability to withstand his boosting art and the Troll's Fury tattoos, Percy figured that raising his resistance to cold would serve him well if he could get it. He might not have a Thescalan's thermal sense, but the modification might allow him to better endure Mickey's soul-freezing mana, possibly letting him use his soul-crushing needle more easily. Even an extra cast per battle could make a huge difference, given how powerful the masterful secret art was. A spatial device hidden in your soul? Casrith asked as soon as Percy stored the vial containing the pale, snow-like moss into his seal. Percy hadn't shown the artifact to his host before, though he had hinted at its existence. Revealing the seal was sadly unavoidable, since Percy would need to store multiple items by the end of this trip. Not a device. It's actually part of my bloodline. He lied through their curved fangs. Percy had no idea if his host bought his bullshit, but thankfully, Casrith didn't press for more answers. Either way, the Blue had no way to examine the artifact directly. Even if he did, he had already failed to recognize the vault's magiscript before, so Percy didn't think his involvement with Metatron was close to being exposed, not unless he was forced to use the Titan's decree in the middle of the arena, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Back in the stadium, they had to wait for a match to finish before it was their turn again. Their third opponent was another female Thescalan, one that Casrith found slightly more attractive than the last one, judging by the more frequent flickers of his forked tongue and his elevated heart rate. Personally, Percy struggled to even tell the 2 women apart. Either way, he wanted to believe that Casrith was serious and experienced enough not to let something this stupid interfere with his ability to fight. Luckily, that didn't happen, but that didn't make the battle any easier. In fact, it was their toughest one yet, and not by a small margin. To nobody's surprise, the woman possessed a composite affinity, like most of the elite disciples in the tournament. This time, it was sound, the fusion of lightning and air. It was a mana type Percy had faced before, but not in a very long time. The mana blended seamlessly with the woman's domain, some of it penetrating Casrith's. A deafening buzz filled the arena from the very start, rupturing Casrith's eardrums within seconds, sticky trickles of blood warming both his hood and the sides of his neck. Did you know this story is from Novelbin? Read the official version for free and support the author. The insidious domain was more annoying than downright crippling. Still, it was much harder to block than even their first opponent's poison steam, forcing them to suffer its effect throughout the battle. If that wasn't enough, it seemed to accelerate the woman's already rapid attacks. A relentless barrage of concussive blasts constantly raining down on Casrith with crushing force. He dodged many of them, but most connected. Even his steel mana failed to stop them completely, the powerful shockwaves penetrating the metallic coating with ease. Luckily, the individual strikes didn't cause much damage, But Percy and his host quickly realized that they wouldn't last a minute unless they adapted. With a heavy heart, Percy was forced to finally reveal his domain. He knew that a few hidden runes and the occasional subtle injection of willpower wouldn't do this time. Unless he joined the fight properly, they wouldn't even be able to defend against the blasts. Of course, if it was just that, the crowd might misinterpret the nature of his contribution. Simply layering his willpower on top of Khasrith's could be attributed to him possessing a stronger domain than he had initially let on. Unfortunately, Percy had to get more involved than that. They had to diversify their efforts, one focusing on defense while the other infused his domain into their attacks. Inevitably, both the spectators and their future opponents would learn that Khasrith possessed two separate domains that could be used concurrently and independently of one another. "At least I doubt anyone will suspect you have an alien soul sharing your body," Percy muttered, mostly to console himself than his host. The good news was that their sacrifice yielded some immediate results. The woman was still nearly impossible to pin down, but Percy's domain massively reduced the damage he and his host took. At the same time, Khasrith was able to focus his willpower on the swords, letting them fly faster and pose a far greater threat to their opponent, while consuming only a fraction of the mana. Even so, the battle was grueling. The woman was impossibly fast, dodging nearly everything, while continuing to land her own blows. Despite Percy's efforts, he was horrified to watch his host's body gradually turn into a bloody mess, shattered scales, rattled organs, and mounted internal damage. "Please, don't let the stadium's enchantments activate," he prayed silently to no gods in particular. Healing their body after the fight would be trivial, thanks to Khasrith's bloodline. But that would only be acceptable if the enchantments didn't swoop in to disqualify them before then. Sadly, their opponent wasn't making things easy. It soon became clear that the woman had more than just her composite affinity to rely on. Watching the ambient mana flood her core, Percy creased his brow, initially thinking that their opponent possessed a boosting art similar to his own. Upon further examination, he realized that the effect wasn't the result of controlled, deliberate efforts, but rather something that she did passively. A bloodline. Unlike Khasrith's, this one could be used in combat. Thankfully, the effect seemed rather minor, weaker than even circulation, let alone the full dance. Still, it needlessly prolonged the fight, making Percy and Khasrith's efforts to whittle down the woman's reserves even more agonizing than they should have been. In the end, the battle didn't last nearly as long as their first, but it was still the second longest of this tournament block so far. It wasn't until several hours later that the Sound Mage finally conceded Percy's domain, doing more to preserve his host's mana than the bloodline did for the woman. The other contestants, the few remaining at least, didn't seem happy that they'd been forced to wait again, but the crowd didn't mind this time, having clearly found the fight exciting enough. 3 victories were more than enough to raise Khasrith's status in the audience's eyes, especially since there weren't that many elite disciples left in this block for the crowd to root for. But Percy didn't care much about his host's reputation. It was finally time to claim their first portion of the ritual's primary ingredient, and to figure out what to do with it. He hoped that Khasrith would be open to going through the incomplete ritual right away, to boost their strength as much as possible for the battles ahead. They'd already revealed their second domain, so they were running out of trump cards fast. The only thing left unused was the full extent of Percy's Magiscript. "I'm not sure that's enough to get us through another 5 rounds, he thought grimly. "Like I said, if you want me to go through the ritual early, you'd better lend me the moss you claimed," Khasrith said with a smirk. Percy suppressed the urge to curse the greedy Thescalan. In theory, his host's demand wasn't all that unreasonable. Percy's reward would be useless until they won the 4th round and earned his own portion of the primary ingredient anyway. Their best bet, as a team, would be to raise Khasrith's strength as much as possible, to increase their odds of making it deeper into the tournament. Not that the greater Thescalan physique would have that big of an impact on them. Khasrith had no access to the carnival or the soul-crushing needle, so the ritual's effects would be subtle. Still, sharpening his thermal sense might help, as would strengthening his body enough to endure more punishment without yielding, especially if their last fight was anything to go by. Luckily, The arena's enchantments had done a great job assessing the severity of Khasrath's wounds this time, not activating to protect him before necessary. Percy suspected that the organizers had tweaked the mechanism slightly to account for his host's life-saving bloodline, which he had disclosed when signing up for the tournament. That said, Percy would feel a lot better about his odds in a tougher vessel. Sadly, there was a problem with giving the abyssal moss to his host. Percy couldn't trust the Thescalan farther than he could throw him. If Khasrath amassed all the ingredients for the ritual this early, he might stop trying to get through the tournament. 5 more rounds might be too much effort for just a single additional reward. Even if he kept trying, there was a chance they would get eliminated early regardless, costing Percy everything. In the end, it appeared that he was overthinking the situation, however. The guide informed them that there wouldn't be a break until after the 4th round, so there wasn't enough time for them to go through the ritual anyway right now. If Percy wanted both the primary ingredient and the life-extending leaf that Cyrneth had promised him, he had no choice but to make it through at least one more round relying solely on their current means. "For your sake, I hope you don't quit on me before this is over," Percy warned the blue. Sure, Khasrath shrugged. "You don't need to threaten me. It's true I've already gained most of the good things, but who would say no to more? Besides, it's not like your leaf is coming out of my pocket. I couldn't care less about whatever deal you've struck with my master." Neither of them said anything else as Khasrath claimed his prize from the personal improvement chamber and listened to its description one last time. Undersir. Greater Thescalan heartblood. Description: the lifeblood harvested from the heart of a deceased demigod of the ancestral lineage sect. After being passed down from master to disciple for 3,912 generations, ancestor Rasaheth's physique had become one of the most developed in modern Thescalan history. Given the demigod's high grade, his body was likely even stronger than the most powerful of our beast ancestors, none of whom is estimated to have evolved beyond blue until after they attained sapience and discarded their original affinity. That said, there is a lot of room for improvement before our bodies reach the level of beasts on our grade, so the inheritor of this vial of heartblood is advised to sire as many offspring as possible, to spread this gift to the rest of our world. The ritual merely involves adding the heartblood, and any of the optional ingredients, to a bath of cold water, and soaking in it for 2 full days and nights. Undersir. The instructions were simple enough, the bloodline of the dead ancestor likely doing all the heavy lifting in this inheritance. Percy wasn't sure how long Thescalan days were exactly, but they felt slightly shorter than those on Remir, so it would probably be fine if he spent a couple of days and nights in the bath back home. Unauthorized usage. This narrative is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. He was tempted to snatch the gemstone vial from Khasrath. It would only take a thought to store the heartblood in his seal and leave Thescala. His host wouldn't be able to stop him. Even without the toxins, Percy might be able to get most of the benefits from the ritual. However, he wasn't in a rush to cut all ties with the slimy blue. "Enjoy your reward," he muttered with a forced smile. "For now," he added, though he kept that part to himself. Before leaving the treasury, Khasrath took his trimmed tunic off, activating his bloodline. The change in perspective was disorienting, and the experience of crawling through their own throat as their old body crumbled and rotted rapidly around them was even more disturbing now that Percy knew what was happening. Still, the relief that discarding their injured flesh brought them made the discomfort worthwhile. Khasrath didn't have any corpses other than his own to consume this time, so their new body only grew to the size of an adolescent before running out of nutrients. They were still missing a few centimeters of height and several kilograms of bone and muscle compared to an adult Thescalan, which wasn't ideal. But it was better than starting their next match all battered up. If they made it through the 4th round, they could find something to eat during the intermission. Returning to the arena, they found their opponent waiting for them. There were only 4 participants left in this block, including Khasrath, and only 2 would move on to the next round. Percy guessed the same would happen in the remaining 7 blocks, a total of 16 contestants getting reshuffled for the second phase of the regional tournament. Either way, they had to win first before they worried about what came next. Percy recognized their current opponent, a toned but lean male Thescalan. He was the same man who had stood on the sidelines unfazed during most of the previous battles, not even bothering to protect himself from any stray projectiles the participants had fired. All the other contestants had shielded themselves with all sorts of barriers of mana or willpower. But not him. He had somehow felt at ease, seemingly knowing that he hadn't been in any danger even as blobs of magma and frozen javelins had whizzed mere centimeters from his face. His affinity was pretty troublesome too, if I'm not mistaken. What was it again? Fire with a weird blessing? Percy asked. Kassereth shook his head. It's a plasma affinity, not a blessing, the blue explained. Percy nodded in understanding. He'd heard of it, but he'd never seen it before this tournament. Connecting the few glimpses of the man's spells with information that he had heard in the past, he reminded himself that the purple plumes of plasma were supposedly hotter than regular flames, while traveling faster than lightning bolts. Of all the composite affinities, plasma was widely regarded as the one with the greatest offensive power, more destructive than even light, though not quite as fast. Why couldn't they have matched us with either of the other two? Kassereth wondered, clicking his tongue. Based on what they'd seen so far, and on the crowd's enthusiastic reaction, the Plasma Mage was not only the strongest participant from their block, but likely one of the favorites for the entire tournament. It wouldn't be surprising if he made the top 4, or even the finals. It doesn't matter, Percy said with a shrug. We're here to win the whole thing, remember? We'd have to face him, or somebody even stronger, sooner or later anyway. Of course, beneath his outer nonchalance, Percy also felt a pang of anxiety over the challenging battle that loomed ahead. Even so, he stood by his words. Kassereth sighed. All right, what's the plan? Let's focus on defense for now. We'll have both domains protecting our body at all times, along with as much mana as we deem necessary. I don't know about you, but I'd rather not let any of this guy's attacks touch us like the sound users did, and I'm not sure we'll be able to dodge them all. Not saying you're wrong, but we won't be able to exhaust his reserves like that, Kassereth pointed out. Outlasting their opponent would inevitably require some back and forth. If the Plasma Mage was the only one attacking, he could easily slow down his assault whenever his core was about to dry up. The only way for Percy and Kassereth to win would be to put some pressure on their opponent by counterattacking, which would sadly expose them to the man's deadly affinity. It's not a permanent solution. No matter how good he is, he's still a blue like us. Once we figure him out, our second domain should allow us to outlast him. But we need to understand how his other trick works too, before committing to an attack, otherwise we'll just be wasting mana. Percy would have loved another minute or two to discuss strategy with his host, and he didn't doubt that Kassereth felt the same way. Alas, the time for talking was over, the white announcer's booming voice cutting it short. Let the first match of the 4th round begin. Focusing on defense had been the right call. The Plasma Mage had barely given Percy and Kassereth a chance to get off the ground and wrap themselves in a thick roll of steel before he began firing devastating projectiles by the dozens. Each purple orb hovered beside them for the briefest of instants, for reasons that Percy had yet to figure out, before slamming violently into their barrier from all sorts of insidious angles. The scorching flares deformed the shield on impact much like the lava user's attacks had. But the plasma projectiles were even faster and more numerous. At least, the ravaged metal blocked most of the force behind each blast, but couldn't do much against the heat, which penetrated just as easily as the sound mage's concussive blows. If it hadn't been for the 2 domains coating Kassereth's body, they would have likely been disqualified already. How the hell is he doing this while spending the same amount of mana as us? Kassereth demanded, frustration evident in his voice. Skill? A stronger domain than either of our own? A good affinity matchup? All of the above, Percy offered, though he wasn't feeling much better about it than his host. Try to gain some distance. Maybe fleeing will cost us less mana than blocking. The situation wasn't sustainable, but Percy wanted to understand something that had been bothering him for a while, before settling on a concrete plan. They could probably win this if he spared some of his willpower to draw some runes on their shield, thus lessening the strain on their reserves. Yet he had a hunch that there was a better path to victory in this particular battle, one that didn't involve revealing their final trump card in the preliminaries. Not that their opponent was weak, far from it, but something about the way he fought rubbed Percy in a peculiar way. Following his suggestion, Kassereth shot out of the arena atop his greatsword, plasma flares continuing to rain on him almost without pause. The attacks only slowed down slightly as Kassereth gained altitude, but the plasma mage was hot on their tail, propelled by 2 steady jets of purple mana shooting from his palms. The man quickly regained his bearings and resumed his relentless onslaught as they all dove into the dome of mist and clouds above the pillar, normally held at bay by the stadium's enchantments. Percy furrowed his host's brow, thinking there had been something off with the brief exchange. Why did his attacks slow down for a while? The plasma mage's accuracy was way higher than it should have been, considering how quickly and erratically both he and Kassereth were moving. But it had suffered for some reason, until they reached the clouds. Strictly speaking, Kassereth was probably the weakest contestant in the entire tournament without Percy's help, but he was still far stronger than a regular blue, and his skill set was quite balanced, his flying speed included. Their opponent shouldn't be having such an easy time landing over 90% of his shots as they both zigzagged through the fog-obscured air. Something else was going on. It was almost as if the man could tell where they would move a second before they did it. Does he have a bloodline similar to my Greater Foresight spell? Is that how he knew whenever he was safe from those stray projectiles during the other fights? The realization caused a faint smile to creep up the corners of Percy's borrowed lips. "Why are you smirking like an idiot?" Kassereth snapped, pressing Percy impatiently. "Please tell me you've figured something out." "I'm working on it," Percy responded, rolling their eyes. "Just give me some time." "Well, hurry up. Our mana is already down by 1/5, and I can't even spare a moment to check how much he has. But I bet it's more than us." The urgency of the situation helped suppress Percy's bubbling enthusiasm. As confident as he was in his assessment, figuring out their opponent's bloodline was only half the battle. Finding a way to deal with it was no less important. Normally, a predictive skill like this would have been extremely difficult to beat. All of the powerful mages Percy had slain over the years would readily attest to that. However, Percy wasn't as worried as somebody else in his shoes would, or should have been, because he was in a unique position to crack the man's ability. Percy knew that perfectly predicting the future was impossible. It fluctuated too much, even projections of the very next moment potentially shifting several times before they became reality, depending on all sorts of minor decisions and variables that constantly changed during a heated battle. The best that people like him and his current opponent could do was to take their best guess, based on whatever information they had available. The deeper into the future they attempted to pry, and the less data they had access to, the blurrier that guess was bound to be. "So, I just need to figure out what information he is basing his predictions off and tamper with it," Percy concluded. "It has to be more than just his regular senses, doesn't it? This tale has been unlawfully lifted from Novelbin. If you spot it on Amazon, please report it." The thermal vision the Thescalans possessed was fancy but entirely useless in a high-level battle like this, especially one involving fire and lightning-based composite affinities. Kassereth's forked tongue couldn't sense anything past the superheated barrier of molten steel protecting them, and Percy doubted their opponent was having an easier time. Even if it hadn't been for the metal, the extreme temperature of the air in their surroundings had definitely cloaked their negligible body heat. Mana sense wouldn't help the plasma user much either, because the thick wall of steel, dense in blue mana as it was, should have obscured Kassereth's internal flow as well. Soul vision was also out of the question, as their opponent didn't have the right affinity for it. That only left the mundane senses, just sight and hearing, really from that distance. Maybe even a way to sense the flow of willpower. Percy wouldn't count on the plasma mage being able to do that, but he included the possibility just to be thorough, since their opponent was an experienced blue who had probably spent centuries fighting with and against domains. Still, it's not enough information. If it was me, I wouldn't have been able to tell a thing in this situation. And yet, there was no doubt that the plasma mage was predicting their moves. This only left one explanation. The man's bloodline didn't just allow him to compile all this information into a projection of the future. it also granted him an additional sense. One that neither Percy nor anybody else possessed, an extra source of data to rely on. All Percy had to do was to find out what this sense was, and to figure out a way to inhibit it. That ought to make their opponent a lot weaker, instantly tilting the scales to their favor. But what is it? Thinking back to the start of the battle, the only time the plasma users' attacks had slowed was during their initial climb out of the stadium. What if it wasn't just the brief adjustment period that had made the man's life harder, but something about the environment? Percy mentally shook his head. That doesn't make any sense. It was just empty air, the same as here. If anything, it was even cleaner inside the dome, since it wasn't shrouded in mist. Shouldn't that have made it easier for him to collect whatever information he needs? Or maybe not. Perhaps the clouds actually helped more than they hurt. Then again, the man's predictive ability had worked just as well by the floor of the arena, and there weren't any clouds there. What did the ground have in common with the clouds? A powerful impact, slightly stronger than the rest, shook the melting barrier, breaking Percy out of his thoughts. The shockwave rattled his host's bones, the twin domains struggling to fend off the scorching heat. For a moment, Percy almost regretted not donating the ingredients for Kassereth to undergo the ritual. The greater Thescalan physique would have made the heat easier to endure. Then, he remembered that they hadn't had enough time to take the bath anyway. Stop spacing out. It's barely been 100 breaths and we're already down to half our mana, Kassereth yelled. Just use your runes. Who cares if everyone learns about them? We'll worry about the finals later. It's better than losing in the preliminaries. Shut up and let me focus, Percy replied calmly. His rude response elicited a round of cursing from his host, but he didn't care. I think I'm onto something here, Percy added, putting the debate to rest. Kassereth wasn't entirely wrong, of course. The instantaneous imprints held the potential of turning the battle around if they used them in a smart way, but the window to do that effectively was shrinking with every drop of mana leaving their core. The plasma mage's projectiles had already turned their own steel barrier into a self-created death trap, a metallic oven slowly cooking them alive. Percy had to do something, and he had to do it fast. Still, he was a greedy person. He didn't just want to win this fight, or stop at the life-extending leaf that waited for him after his victory against the plasma mage. He wanted more. He wanted everything. Why shouldn't he? He was the only Redborn in the universe who dared to dream of becoming a god. As somebody who wished to achieve the impossible, he had to strive for it at every turn. He had to surpass everyone else, the Yellowborns, the Greenborns, the elite disciples, the demigods, the titans, the greater springs, and even the Moirai. Opportunities like this tournament didn't come by every day. Percy would be damned if he let one slip through his fingers. He couldn't afford to only think about this battle. He had to position himself as well as he could to win the next 4 rounds as well. Come on, Percy. Think. What does the ground have in common with the clouds? The flares continued to slam onto their barrier one after another. Percy couldn't tell which way their opponent was attacking them from, since the spells kept coming from every direction. By now, Kassereth had no choice but to fly randomly, since they couldn't spare a sliver of attention to locate the plasma mage. Wait, every direction? Why is he going overboard like that? Blocking an enemy's escape routes was never a bad plan, but that wasn't exactly applicable in this fight. Kassereth could still smash his way out of the encirclement whenever he wanted. The impacts on his metallic shield just cost him more mana and willpower. But the plasma mage was landing almost all of his blows anyway, so it didn't make a difference whether he fired them in a straight line or at an angle. If anything, it would have been more efficient not to waste time or energy diverting the paths of his spells. Unless there was a reason for doing so. Come to think of it, I never figured out why he delayed his initial attack long enough to surround us with orbs. It was almost like the man needed, to have dozens of constructs around Kassereth at all times. Could that be related to the mystery sense he was using to predict their movements? But how would the purple flares even help with that? All they did was release a ton of heat, pack a lot of force, and shine brightly. Percy gasped, everything finally clicking together. The ground and the clouds that had aided their opponent, The empty air that had worsened the man's predictions instead of improving them, and the bright orbs that had to constantly shine on Kassereth from nearly every angle. "It's the shadows," Percy exclaimed, his reptilian heart skipping a beat. "That's how he's guessing our moves." Percy couldn't, for the life of him, understand how reading Kassereth's shadows helped the plasma mage in this situation, especially since his host was constantly enveloped in a steel barrier that obscured his body's movements. Were the rigid shadows of the metallic shield and the flying greatsword enough to improve the man's predictions? Well, it's not just the shadow sense on its own. It's the combination of all these separate streams of information. Percy shook his concerns away, once again reminding himself that trying to understand the inner workings of someone's bloodline was nothing but an exercise in futility. It was a fact that the plasma mage had gone out of his way to cast as many shadows onto the battlefield as he could, and that the accuracy of his spells had shot through the roof as a direct consequence of that. The rest was irrelevant. Kassereth responded to Percy's discovery with a wave of confusion. "I'm not sure what you think you've figured out, but I'm going to need some actionable steps soon. We're down to a third of our reserves." Percy nodded grimly. Seeing through their opponent's trick wouldn't mean much if they failed to execute an effective counterattack. Not wasting a moment, he seized control of some of the discarded metal melting off the surface of his host's barrier, shaping it into a couple of long swords. They were cruder than the ones Kassereth created, but Percy wasn't planning to enter them into an art competition. Commanding the constructs to spin rapidly, he fanned away as much of the mist as he could, trying to create a gap in the clouds. Percy didn't know what their opponent's bloodline was called, but the name Shadow Red sounded apt. Let's see what happens when you have nothing left to read. Obviously, the plasma mage wouldn't just let them do as they pleased. The moment Percy's plan became clear, the man targeted the swords, destroying them with a few well-placed shots. That only emboldened Percy further, however. Their opponent's desperate move not only confirmed his suspicions, but also lifted some pressure off Kassereth. "Divert some mana from the barrier to the weapons and help me blow the clouds away," Percy yelled inwards. "Are you crazy? He's going to turn us to cinders if we stop defending," Kassereth protested. "Just listen to me. We'll never give him the chance. If I'm right, the domains will be more than enough to protect us. Besides, your life isn't really at risk. At worst, the stadium's enchantments will save you, so stop being a chicken." The Thescalan didn't seem very pleased to be bossed around, and by a guest in his own body, no less, but he ultimately complied, helping Percy along. The fog around them thinned, despite the plasma user's efforts to prevent that. Sadly for him, he no longer held the upper hand. He directed most of the flares toward the spinning constructs, but collecting and recycling the purple motes of mana into additional attacks was a lot harder than it was for Percy and Kassereth to reshape the molten blobs of metal into new longswords. Each affinity had its strengths and weaknesses, after all. The few attacks their opponent could spare toward Kassereth didn't land nearly as often as before, giving Percy and his host plenty of time to rebuild and reinforce their barrier and produce even more swords. Just like that, the battle took a sudden turn, the plasma mage's previously insurmountable advantage evaporating like a snowball beneath the summer sun. "What the hell's a chicken anyway?" Kassereth asked once his mana consumption dropped to a more manageable level, giving him and Percy a chance to catch their breath. Percy froze upon realizing his blunder. "Just a type of horned fish I saw on some aquatic world. It's known for its cowardice." He lied through his fangs, sending Kassereth the image of a random fish scurrying away under the gaze of one of his previous hosts. Help support creative writers by finding and reading their stories on the original site. Not that he expected chickens, or of all things, to be famous across the universe. Hell, even if he told the Blue that he was a human, Kassereth would probably have no idea what that meant. Still, Percy reminded himself that Kassereth wasn't his friend. He was at best a temporary ally, but one that couldn't be trusted outside their mutual goal of advancing through the tournament. If he ended up dooming all of Remir due to something this dumb, Percy wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. Even robbed of his secret weapon, the plasma user was still a difficult opponent to pin down. Fortunately, The skillful use of his affinity and his domain weren't enough to give him the edge over Percy and Kasrith's combined strength. The two continued to fight while keeping the area around them clear of clouds, slowly closing the gap to their opponent's reserves. As it turned out, the man hadn't been in a much better state than them to begin with. He might have dominated the first part of the battle, but it soon became apparent that he had only managed that by consuming his mana almost as rapidly as them. It didn't take long for Percy and Kasrith to catch up and force their opponent on the back foot, or backtail, leaving him no choice but to flee to the relative safety of the nearest clouds. Now what? We can't chase him there unless we waste more mana to clear the area. Otherwise we'll be back to square one, Kasrith groaned, a grimace marring his face. Percy shrugged, not nearly as worried. We'll wait for him to come out of his own volition, he replied, taking a deep breath after another to replenish their reserves. He'll recover too if we give him the chance. We'll have to whittle his mana down all over again, Kasrith protested, clearly unconvinced. It doesn't matter. He only has two options. Either he fights us on our terms, or he can stay over there, floating in his little cloud for the next few days. Everyone in the tournament knows who the champion of attrition is. No matter what he chooses, this one's in the bag. Kasrith visibly relaxed upon listening to his explanation. Sure enough, the plasma user eventually understood the situation too, coming to terms with his inevitable loss. Perhaps he could have tried his chances with an all-out attack, but their earlier battle had made it clear that neither side was capable of ending things quickly. I surrender, he said a couple hours later, his voice soft and resigned. Next, he flew back to the stadium, Kasrith leisurely floating behind him. Where did you even come from? I don't remember seeing you in any of the previous tournaments, the plasma mage asked once they were closer. I didn't feel confident in the past. I experienced a major breakthrough with the way I wield my domain recently, so I decided to try my luck this year, Kasrith replied in half-truths. Percy knew his host wasn't above lying outright, but the Thescalan had to be mindful of what he said, since people might have questions for him later. I look forward to facing you again next year, the plasma mage said with a sigh. Ah yes, me too. You fought well. Kasrith awkwardly returned the man's polite words as Percy struggled to stifle his laughter. Good luck facing any of these people without my help. I hope they don't strip your elite disciple status too soon. Screw you. They can't force me to register again. Besides, even if they take my trim away, they can't take my greater Thescalan physique. You should be more worried about yourself. You might kill yourself during the ritual. Percy remained silent, knowing this was a real danger he had to watch out for. Still, the risk wasn't going to deter him from trying. The priceless reward was way too alluring. Soon, they reached the stadium. Before they even entered the dome, they heard the crowd erupt with cheers, all of their adoration now aimed at Kasrith, a previously unknown contestant who had somehow emerged victorious from the preliminaries. Percy was in such a great mood that he didn't even feel like saying anything snarky, giving his slimy host a few minutes to wave at his new fans and revel in his unexpected triumph. How long is the break before the finals again? He asked once Kasrith slithered away from the arena. 5 days, I think? That's more than enough time for me to take that bath if you've reconsidered lending me the moss, the Thescalan replied. Dream on, Percy spat, not entertaining the idea for even a second. With the main ingredient, he would now have everything he needed to undergo the ritual himself, if only an incomplete version. He wasn't going to throw all of that away on a gamble. Yet, there was something even more pressing on his mind than the physique. Do you have a way to contact your master? He asked again. This was it. Percy and Kasrith had made the top 16, as requested by Cyrnith. The Elder now owed him one of the life-extending leaves that had elevated this entire planet into a greater spring. The only thing holding Percy back from taking the nearest teleportation platform to the Broken Fong sect to demand his prize was the fact that he wasn't done with the tournament quite yet. I do. The new spatial pin they gave me after my promotion functions as a communication device too. Let's grab that after we leave the treasury, Kasrith said, his good mood making him a little more helpful than usual. Percy couldn't help but rub his hands in anticipation. He just hoped the elder would uphold his end of the bargain. Percy watched with curiosity as Casrith's new pin projected a glowing, circular screen, hovering a few meters in front of them. It was taller than a person, countless flashing colors swirling chaotically within it. They only lasted for a moment, before settling into the familiar image of Cernith's chamber, still thick with mist like the last time Percy saw it. The process reminded Percy of the portals to the vault of magic he could summon through Metatron's decree, but the colorful screen only allowed light and sound to pass through. It wasn't a gateway to a different world. He and Casrith had picked up the device not long after claiming their fourth prize from the treasury. They'd sought out the privacy of one of the rooms available to the contestants during the intermission so that they could contact the elder. Well, if it isn't my most prized disciple. The violet mused, meditating atop his coiled tail as always, not even bothering to open his eyes. The man's pin glowed brightly on the side of his tunic, just like their own. Percy had no idea if regular elders had access to the same premium devices as the elite disciples, or if Cernith's was only capable of receiving calls but not initiating them. Either way, he couldn't help but feel a little envious of the Thescalans' advanced technology. With a few enchanted pins like these, Percy would have been able to contact Nesha or Elaine whenever he wanted, without having to keep clones stationed in their bodies. Not that they didn't have anything similar on Remir, but the artifacts Jason and Deimos had used to communicate weren't widespread. Even worse, they seemed to require a very specific combination of affinities to function, one of them being among the rarest in existence. Needless to say, they wouldn't be usable by the general public unless House Etna made some major improvements to their design. Percy would have considered grabbing a couple of pins before leaving Thescala, but he knew his spatial seal couldn't contain other storage devices. If he wanted his own, he would have to study how they were made in the vault, or commission Metatron to incorporate that functionality into the seal. It's probably a bad idea, he thought, instantly deciding against it. The darn thing was already a risk. While he had made the Titan craft it slowly in front of him, there was always a chance that Metatron had secretly tampered with the artifact. Giving the god explicit permission to add communication features to it would be the dumbest move imaginable. In any case, Percy had more important matters to worry about than the convenient pins. "You've been following the tournament closely, I take it?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. Cernith nodded. "Naturally. The event is pretty fun to watch even when I don't have a subordinate participating. I have to admit, you've surprised me more than once. The second domain wasn't unexpected, given your circumstances, but I still have no idea how you outlasted the woman with the toxic steam or overpowered the lava mage. Even getting rid of the plasma user's shadows was something I only understood after watching the match twice." Percy noticed that the elder was being mindful of his words, pretending to speak to Casrith while avoiding mentioning Percy directly. He'd only talked about their situation in implicit terms. Perhaps these communication devices weren't as secure as they would have liked. "What can I say? I live to entertain," he replied with a shrug. He saw no reason to explain how his insomnia trait worked. As for his runecrafting, it would become a lot more obvious when he inevitably went all out during the finals. But Cernith would have to be patient like everyone else. "I hope you haven't forgotten our deal, though," Percy said, giving the elder a pointed look. "The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident." Cernith's eyes finally opened, a faint smile forming on his lips, one that didn't quite reach his slit pupils. "Of course not," he exclaimed in the most faux amicable tone Percy had ever heard. "You've delivered as promised, so you can rest assured I'll honor our agreement." The man's forced enthusiasm rubbed Percy the wrong way. He could practically feel the barely concealed contempt hiding beneath Cernith's words, but he wasn't sure what to say. Oblivious to his thoughts, the violet summoned something from his spatial pin, seemingly eager to demonstrate his sincerity. It was a crimson cushion embroidered with intricate, golden patterns. A strange object rested atop the cushion, somewhat resembling an oak leaf. However, it looked more like it had been carved out of the finest piece of jade than harvested from an actual tree. It was flat, its perimeter full of bumpy curves, the veins on its surface shimmering in a vibrant green light that pierced through the fog with ease, illuminating the dim chamber. Percy's eyes widened at the sight, and not only because of the artifact's otherworldly beauty or its importance to his mission. It only took a single glance for him to realize how closely it resembled something he had seen before, and at the most unexpected place to boot. Granted, the object sitting in front of the Thescalan elder was several times larger than its counterpart, about thrice as wide as a man's palm, and shone with far greater intensity. Percy had several questions about it, but he stuck to the most important for now. Was it difficult to get your hands on it? It would probably be a good idea to know if a bunch of angry demigods would come looking for the leaf later. The violet chuckled. I didn't steal it, if that's what you're asking. There was some pushback when I requested it, but not as much as I expected. Apparently, your success in the tournament has turned you into a star within the sect. The higher-ups seemed quite willing to accommodate you. Granted, they did ask why you want a second leaf, so I told them about that low-born relative of yours who needs it. Percy nodded. You look rather pleased yourself. Are they treating you better than before? Not that he cared much about the elder status at Hell. He couldn't care less about Casrithas either, but he figured that maintaining a good relationship with the Violet might improve his odds of getting what he wanted. As a matter of fact, they are, the man replied, his smile widening. I'm essentially a Grand Elder in everything but name. Keep the good work up, and they might even make it official. Everything's fine then? Can I come back to the sect and collect my leaf right away if I want to? No tricks? Percy asked again, finding this a little too easy. Most certainly. The leaf is yours, Cernith exclaimed. But I would advise you to take the next few days to rest instead of traveling. There's no reason to ruin your chances in the tournament. Your prize isn't going anywhere. You have my word. With that, the elder pressed his thumb against the pin to end the transmission, not even waiting for a response. Percy sighed. He still wasn't convinced things would go smoothly. On the surface, Cernith had been nothing but polite and helpful, but the Violet's gaze left a pit in Percy's stomach, the coldness in the elder's eyes making him feel like he was being stared at by a hungry beast rather than a person. No wonder Casrith had seemed so terrified of his master when they first met. Despite the Violet's assurances, there was a good chance he had no intention of handing Percy the leaf. I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. Let's grab everything I can from this place first. Perhaps it would have been more prudent to return to the sect right now and use his participation in the finals as leverage to demand the leaf. Threatening to drop out of the competition might force the Violet to keep his promise. The problem was that Percy wanted the tournament's sweet rewards as much as Casrith and his master did. And they knew it too. He didn't want to get into a fight with the elder and end up fleeing Thescala empty-handed. Depending on how much these people valued the leaves, they might be willing to sacrifice everything else to keep them. Turning his attention back to his host, Percy focused on something else. You never explained where these leaves come from or how they work. Casrith had told him that eating one would permanently extend his lifespan, but not by how much. It was important information, as it would determine what grade it would allow him to reach, how much closer to his lofty goal of attaining godhood it would bring him, and how many more greater springs he would need to visit. More importantly, Percy had noticed something strange during the meeting. The leaf looked nearly identical to those adorning the jade tree his family possessed. Obviously, the two couldn't have come from the same place. Their sizes were too different, and the Divine Order would have never gifted something that precious to House Avalon, not even to compensate them for producing a greenborn. Still, the resemblance was uncanny. Too much so to be a coincidence. Casrith answered with a question of his own. Have you heard of the World Tree? Percy gasped upon listening to Casrith's question. As a matter of fact, he had heard of the World Tree during one of Mrs. Leah's classes on Felmara. It was one of the examples she had given her students while teaching them about elemental sources, since it was one of the most famous. It was a special case even among the others of its kind, as it manifested as a living being rather than an inanimate object. Perhaps that was only to be expected, considering that it was the elemental source of the life affinity. Scholars speculated that some of the other undiscovered sources might work like that, including the one for the beast affinity that Xixiang was rumored to own, or the missing source of the soul affinity. Well, having personally been to the Mirror Lake, Percy hadn't detected any signs of life or sentience. Still, he hadn't expected to find another elemental source so soon. Was the World Tree actually owned by Theskala? Wait, no. That can't be the case, he thought, mentally shaking his head. Based on what he had seen on Melodia, elemental sources tended to strongly influence the population living on their planet, giving sapients the corresponding affinity from birth, something that clearly didn't apply here. In theory, it was possible that Kasrith's people owned multiple planets, and that they imported their leaves from a different one, thus explaining why the residents of Theskala didn't all have the life affinity. Or maybe they had found a way to block the source's influence. But there was another reason Percy was convinced that wasn't the case. He knew that the World Tree no longer existed. According to Mrs. Liao, it had been lost eons ago, after multiple powerful factions had fought desperately over it. At the end of the war, the World Tree had been destroyed, along with the very planet it had taken root on. In theory, elemental sources could reappear elsewhere if they got destroyed, but that didn't seem to have happened with the World Tree, for reasons a lower spring like Felmara wasn't privy to. None of the greater springs had made any moves to search for it after its destruction. "I'll take that as a yes," Kasrith said, clearly sensing his inner turmoil. "You may have heard about the original tree's destruction, though I suppose the rest isn't common knowledge yet. Long story short, the factions fighting over it managed to salvage many of its pieces, planting them on their own worlds. Most of them died, but a few of the largest ones took root, eventually growing into giant saplings. 13 of them in total. That many? Is that why a new World Tree hasn't appeared?" Percy asked. "Probably. This is all speculation, mind you, since this is the only documented case of an elemental source surviving in a fragmented state like this. The consensus among the wisest titans in the universe is that a new World Tree will only emerge after at least 12 of the 13 saplings have died. Either they get destroyed and give the rest room to grow, or they consume one another to speed up the process. The last sapling should grow into the complete tree. If it gets destroyed too, a new tree will probably appear elsewhere from scratch." "Is Theskala one of those factions then?" Kasrith shook his head. "I wish. We aren't ranked nearly that high among the greater springs. We do have a sapling on our planet, but it's not one of the original 13. And we've only obtained it thanks to our allies." Percy remained silent, prompting his host to continue. "To understand our situation, you first have to understand the dynamics at play during the war. There were two sides fighting for the World Tree, the Moirai and the Void Hand, a grand alliance formed for the sole purpose of opposing them. Theskala is merely one of the weaker members of the Hand." The revelation caused Percy's borrowed eyes to widen. He'd always known that the Moirai stood at the very top of the entire universe, but he'd never realized just how wide the gap between them and the other factions was. Their enemies had been forced to band together to compete with them. This content has been misappropriated from Novelbin. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. And Theskala, this bustling world that put Remir to shame at every turn, clearly wasn't even qualified to enter the inner circle of the Void Hand. Just how many members, how many greater springs, were part of this alliance? "What about Xixiang?" he asked, suddenly remembering that the divine beasts were supposedly on par with the Moirai. "They're powerful enough to rival our alliance and the Moirai, but they didn't participate in the war. At least not initially, though you can rest assured that they didn't miss out. Those gluttonous bastards swooped in after the fact, grabbing for saplings. Nobody was happy about that, but neither the Moirai nor our alliance was in any position to pick a new fight at the time." "How did the other 9 saplings get distributed then?" Kasrith shrugged. "The Moirai got 4 as well while we took the rest. Only 5 of the allied members were greater springs back then, so they each kept 1. Though only 4 have survived to this day, the 5th of our founding members got wiped out at some point. Their sapling exchanged many hands, before eventually ending up on a neutral world that nobody can steal from. There was a lot of information there." Percy was quite curious about this 4th party that neither the Moirai the divine beasts, nor this massive alliance could easily invade. However, he focused on something more relevant to his current situation. So, you're saying that Theskala wasn't a greater spring yet? It wasn't. Back then, there weren't as many in the universe, only about 100 or so. Sadly, our greedy allies refused, and still do, to share their original method of accelerating their advancements with us. We only managed to become a greater spring later, thanks to the leaves. Percy fought to suppress a smile. He wouldn't be surprised if at least some of those allies had earned their status due to the cyan powder. Casrith's people had probably spent eons begging them to share their secret. They would lose their minds if they knew Percy could reveal it with a few words. But he kept those thoughts to himself. Where exactly did your tree come from? You said it's not one of the original 13. It's not. Not long after the World Tree's destruction, we discovered that the first-generation saplings could produce more seeds and saplings of their own. There is no limit to their number, so our allies could have easily given us more than one. But they didn't, Percy guessed. They didn't, Casrith confirmed with a sigh. Our alliance is based on mutual interests, not love or friendship. The founding members want to bolster our strength so that we're more useful against the Moirai, but not enough that we challenge their authority. They're extremely mindful of what they give us. Percy felt the urge to swear. Not because he cared about the shitty dynamics of this alliance, but because he realized something else. Your leaves. Don't tell me that they're less effective than those of the first-generation saplings? Casrith smiled wryly. Ours only double your remaining lifespan. The originals triple it. Percy wasn't happy to hear that at all, but he still took some time to calculate what this meant for him. Estimating one's remaining lifespan wasn't easy, because it varied slightly from one person to another. People on Remir operated under the assumption that the average Redborn would live about 80 years if they never advanced. However, some might die of old age at 70, while others could easily make it to 90. Higher grades eliminated some of the discrepancy because they made one more resilient against disease or other external factors. That said, the timing of their promotions added another variable into the equation. Some people were more prudent with their cleansing sessions, always drinking their elixirs without wasting a single moment. Others would occasionally miss a day for one reason or another. Percy tried to fall into the former category as much as possible, but calculating his own lifespan was even messier than most due to all the extra things he had to consider. He had missed a lot of time as a child, because he'd only had access to the diluted elixirs and hadn't obtained his second core until his mid-teens. Even worse, every wasted year as a red with a single core had been worth 18 of his years now that he was a double yellow. On top of that, he'd missed a year of cleansing his first core due to his injuries after Huehue, and wasted a lot more time before he earned enough money to upgrade first to the regular elixirs, and later to the Cyan Paste or the Aurora Dew. When all's said and done, I should have about 1100 years left, give or take a couple decades, he concluded after taking everything into account. Of course, that was without considering his advancements. At his current pace, he should reach green with both cores in about 166 years, and blue in 1666. He would get to live a little over 5,000 years in total, assuming his enemies didn't kill him sooner. That should take him less than a quarter of the way to Violet. All of that was before eating the leaf. If he managed to bring it home, he might live to 15,000. The treasure would only double his current remaining lifespan, but it would effectively triple his eventual lifespan, because it would allow him to consume less of it before his next promotions, which would matter a lot more later. It wasn't bad, not at all. Percy would be able to accomplish so much more with an extra 10,000 years. But it still won't get me to Violet, he grimaced. Percy double and triple checked his math to make sure he hadn't missed anything. No matter how he reasoned about it, the result was clear as day, however. Even after eating the leaf, he'd fall short of reaching Violet by over 3,000 years. And the worst thing was the knowledge that this could have been avoided, if only he hadn't lost so much time during his childhood. Had Percy consumed a leaf, obtained his second core, and gained access to the Aurora Dew as soon as he awakened, he could have lived nearly 20,000 years, reaching Violet with time to spare. No sense in crying over cracked eggs, he decided. shaking the pointless thoughts out of his head. He couldn't change his past any more than he could change his birth grade. Still, that didn't mean that all hope was lost. Percy was only 37 years old right now, and he'd accomplished so much with his bloodline in so little time. There was no telling what he could achieve in the next 15,000 years. It was a bit of a bummer that his first greater spring since the Morai couldn't do enough to get him to the next grade, but it would still bring him so much closer. And there were hundreds of worlds as advanced or more for him to visit. Let's be real though, most of them are relying on either crystallization or the saplings. I already got my second core from the Morai and I doubt I can copy the Divine Beast's methods. I wonder how many discoveries are left that are still applicable to me. He reminded himself, tempering his expectations. The good news was that Percy had a lead of his own to test. Between his boosting art, the compression principle, the vault's rune crafting and precasting, he still hoped to give himself an artificial advancement. Reaching that goal might require a lot of time or several additional insights, but he was confident that he could make it happen. After all, the dance of the savage gods already did most of the heavy lifting. If Percy succeeded, he would skip a grade and triple his lifespan without delaying his next advancement. For all intents and purposes, it would be like turning himself into a fake Orangeborn, since all his future promotions would effectively require a tenth of their original cleansing time to reach. Even better, this would automatically give him the extra bit of time he would be missing toward his fifth natural promotion after eating the leaf. All of these effects would compound nicely, allowing him to reach white with ease. Depending on how early he gave himself the artificial advancement, Percy might end up quite close to the clear grade, just a step away from becoming a demigod, forging his internal world and attaining godhood. Thinking about that, he suddenly felt a lot better, especially since his host had already provided him with another clue as to where he could get the final push he would be missing. Those first-generation leaves that triple your lifespan, will they still work on me after I eat one of yours? Kasrith shrugged. They will, but don't expect the effects to stack. You'll only get the difference, an extra 1.5 times multiplier after the second-generation leaf. How do you know that if you don't have them? It's been tested extensively. Our allies might be stingy with their saplings and seeds, but they're more than willing to reward our strongest demigods with one of the better leaves in exchange for exemplary contributions to the Void Hand. Is there a chance we can win one during the final rounds of the tournament? Percy asked, some hope finding its way into his voice. Giving himself an artificial advancement was far from a certainty, but the combination of that and a first-generation leaf would actually be enough for him to reach his goal. No way, Kasrith said, bursting his bubble. Our leaders keep most of the leaves for their own people. Even the few they give us would never end up in an event meant for blues or violets, no matter how talented we are. In fact, don't expect to find any of the second-generation leaves in the prize pool either. The organizers don't bother to offer them, since all the participants have already eaten one by the time they are eligible to register. Stolen content warning. This tale belongs on Novelbin. Report any occurrences elsewhere. Percy nodded, not letting his host's words get to him. He'd never expected this to be easy, but the path forward was clear at last. His best bet was still to get the leaf from Cyrnith. After returning home, he would have to work on upgrading his boosting art as quickly as possible. Of course, that would have to wait until after he created his wasp familiar, since Nephthys' pyramid had already started showing signs of decay, even before he set out for Thescala. Finally, Percy would have to continue sending out clones and searching aggressively for more greater springs, looking for one of the planets with a first-generation sapling, or something equally useful. If he managed to complete all 3 of those steps fast enough, he would be on track to become the first Redborn god in the universe. Forcing himself to calm down, he shifted his attention to something else. Have you seen anything like this before? He asked, showing Kasrith an image of his family's jade tree. Naturally, he removed the background and any other distinguishing features that might allow his host to link the strange plant to humanity or Remir. It's definitely a world tree sapling, Kasrith confirmed, though his next few words smothered Percy's growing enthusiasm right in its crib. Third? No, probably 4th or even 5th generation. I've never been to our tree before, but I've seen plenty of illustrations. They look almost identical, save for the size difference. Where did you find it? Just some barren world. I don't know its name, Percy lied. Then again, that might be exactly where the Divine Order had found the plant, before bringing it back to Remir and gifting it to his family. Would its leaves also extend one's lifespan? Don't tell me I should have grabbed a handful while I had the chance. You're overthinking it. Only first and second generation leaves do that. Third generation leaves only have some minor healing properties, but the one you showed me probably doesn't even have that. It's only good for meditating on life magic. Even then, its effect should be a far cry from a true elemental sources. Lower generation saplings have leaked to lesser springs and barren worlds a long time ago. By now, they're pretty widespread, though I doubt many of the people living there know of their origin. It's really not that surprising that you stumbled upon one, considering your bloodline. Percy sighed. This was only to be expected, though he wouldn't have said no to a way of boosting his relatives' lifespans, even slightly. What about the original world tree? Are its leaves more effective than the first-generation saplings? Kasrith frowned. Possibly. Nobody knows, since the war started almost as soon as the world tree was discovered. By the time people learned of that effect, none of the original leaves remained. If you want to know the answer to that question, well, the Thescalan didn't complete his sentence, but his meaning was clear. Percy would have to unite or destroy all 13 of the saplings, allowing a new world tree to emerge. Perhaps it was an impossible dream. The Moirai, the Void Hand, and the Divine Beasts had all failed to do that. What hope did a lone mortal from some backwater planet even have? Then again, Percy could go where nobody else could. Maybe there was a chance. And if his experiments with the dance failed, this might become a necessity. It's something to consider if the opportunity arises and I run out of alternatives. For now, I should focus on the tournament and Cyrnith. No matter what, I can't afford to leave this place without everything I want. If you're done interrogating me, I'd like to grab something to eat, Kasrith suddenly said, breaking him out of his thoughts. Percy nodded, remembering that his host's body was still that of an adolescent. It hadn't mattered much during their fight with the plasma mage, but they had yet to regain their full size since they used their bloodline after the third round, and they would need a lot of food to give Kasrith the height and mass he was missing. Based on what the Blue had explained, consuming his own discarded body was by far the most effective way to recover, followed by eating the corpse of another Thescalan. Regular food barely even did anything. Luckily, the tournament held a banquet for the participants during the intermission. Both the winners and the losers were allowed to join. Kasrith didn't even wait for a response, already slithering out of their private cavern. Summoning one of his flying greatswords, he rode it toward one of the neighboring pillars, the same one where the finals would be held before entering a tunnel near its midsection. It was time for them to unwind a little. Go on then, Percy said. I'm not sure how much restoring your body will help, but we'll need every advantage we can get. I bet our next fights will be a lot tougher. Kasrith, and, by extension, Percy, stood at the side of the arena, waiting for the battles to begin. The pillar they were on looked identical to the other 7, both inside and out. The stadium had the same number of seats, all of them filled with cheering spectators. The air trembled with the collective hum of thousands of voices, a living tide that ebbed and swelled with every movement on the stage. The faint scent of hot oils from snack vendors drifted between the rows, making Kasrith's mouth water. For the most part, everything felt the same as the preliminaries. Percy knew this was an illusion, however. Most people were watching from home, the countless eyes previously scattered across the 8 blocks now converging upon them. On top of that, the second phase of the tournament would likely draw even more attention, and the fights were now spaced farther apart to give everyone a chance to watch them all. Alas, there was nothing he could do about it, other than grit his host's gums and do his best to win the prizes. Kasrith was scheduled for the first match, but they still had some time before it started, time that they were using productively. Well, sort of. Careful. Less pressure. You're going to shatter my core. Kasrith's voice cracked in Percy's mind, edged with panic. Percy drew mana from his host's stomach, guiding it to his sternum. He paused for a fraction of a second, aiming at the hairline cracks the initial burst had revealed, then sent the elixir-augmented mana into them. Calm down. Percy rolled their eyes. I'm not an idiot. I wouldn't risk crippling you right before our fight. Look closely. I'm going slower than you showed me. The real risk here is wasting the pill, not damaging the organ. He'd been on Thescala for several weeks now, with plenty of opportunities to watch Kasrith's so-called cascading cracks technique in action. They hadn't missed a single session either, except during their first fight, which had lasted 5 days. Percy's proficiency was climbing nicely as a result. It was a tricky technique to learn, but experiencing Kasrith's mana flow directly made all the difference. Percy had even pressured his host into letting him try it by himself a few times, much to the Blues' dismay. At this rate, Percy was confident he'd master the technique within a month after returning to Remir. Incorporating it into his current core cleansing method might take a bit longer, but that was ultimately a small price to pay to essentially double his stash of Aurora Dew. Mickey would have it even easier with just a single core to cleanse. The clone would pass him the knowledge in no time once they reshuffled. For Percy, the cascading cracks technique was among the least impactful things he'd found on Thescala, which only spoke volumes to how rich Greater Springs truly were. If he compared it to most of his other adventures, the cleansing art was quite the haul. Still, it fell short of the life-extending leaf or the body-strengthening ritual. That only applied to him as an individual, however. Neither of those things could be used by a large number of people, so the cleansing technique was by far the most important thing to bring back to Remir. You speak as if wasting my cleansing session is a small matter, Kasrith snapped, though he sounded less tense now that he realized he wasn't in danger. What's the big deal? Percy shrugged. You're a Yellowborn with a doubled lifespan. Missing a day, or hell, even a century, won't stop you from reaching the clear grade. Kasrith clicked his tongue. Becoming a demigod isn't everything. Sure, attaining divinity doesn't require a fixed amount of time like the earlier grades, but that doesn't mean you can do it instantly. Need I remind you that most ancestors in the universe run out of time in the end? Okay. Percy had to admit that his host had a point. This story has been stolen from Novelbin. If you read it on Amazon, please report it. Even among Greenborns, only a tiny fraction made it to godhood. Comprehending a concept and forging one's internal world was a monumental challenge. The most talented demigods achieved that in mere centuries, but others exhausted their remaining lifespan, often tens of thousands of years, only to fail. For someone like Percy, who'd been told his whole life that he'd never reach white, let alone clear, even a slim chance of becoming a demigod was cause for joy. Even if he only got a few years left in that grade, he was determined to make them count. Still, it wouldn't hurt to plan ahead, to ensure that he gave himself some leeway. Especially since he had a hunch that his promotion to godhood would be a lot messier than the average demigods. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, a booming voice said, drawing everyone's attention. The sound rolled through the arena like a struck gong, resonating in the chest more than the ears, and the crowd responded in kind, slapping their tails against the ground, clapping, even hissing sect chants that tangled together into an electric chaos. The announcer was another elderly wight with a trim, but not the same one as before. Percy was once again reminded of how lucrative this tournament was. They had over 100 such powerful figures serving as mere presenters each year. Today, we gather for the tournament's main event, the finals. The man paused, letting the crowd's roar crest before continuing. Every elite disciple in the tournament is a remarkable mage, the pride of our world. This applies as much to those eliminated early as it does to the chosen few standing before me. To all the defeated contestants, I wish you luck with your training. We hope to see you again next year. That said, some of our young talents have climbed higher than their peers. It is them that we are here to celebrate. The elder turned toward Kasrith and the others, his gaze lingering on each of them for a moment. The first match of the 5th round will be fought between veteran of 67 tournaments and 3-time champion, Lothsalath of the Tall Pillar sect, and this year's rising star, Kasrith of the Broken Fang sect. May you compete confidently, and honorably, remember that all of Theskala is watching. Percy swallowed hard. This was exactly what he was worried about. But it was too late to back down now. Oblivious to his thoughts, his host and his opponent slithered onto the stage, stopping a couple dozen meters apart. Lothsalath bore a long vertical scar over his left eye, a wound he could have healed easily, yet had clearly chosen to keep. It was likely a memento from some old battle, or a cliché fashion statement. Percy hadn't seen him fight, since they'd come from different blocks. Luckily, Kassereth knew a few things about him, as the man was quite famous. Like Kassereth, he had an innate metal affinity and fought similarly. But Lothsalath had something else that his host didn't. "If both contestants are ready," the announcer said, receiving 2 nods. "Let the match begin." A silver bloom of liquid mana erupted from each fighter's body. One rapidly condensed into a flock of flying longswords, the other into a storm of throwing axes. Neither side wasted any time, hurling their constructs against one another. The crisp ting of metal filled the arena alongside a spray of silver fragments and orange sparks. Gasps and shouts rippled through the stands as the first collisions rang out, though Percy and Kassereth tuned them out, used to the crowd by now. Both combatants remained glued to the ground, knowing that this match would be decided by the quality of their constructs, the efficiency by which they forged them, and the skill with which they manipulated them, not their ability to fly away. Unfortunately, this was a contest that Kassereth was bound to lose. He wasn't bad in any of these areas. His opponent was simply better. Percy quickly noticed that his host's swords shattered more easily, each axe slashing through 2 or even 3 before breaking. The scarred man's domain pressed forward, pushing against Kassereth's in lockstep with his weapons. Within seconds, Lothsalath seized control of 2/3 of the battlefield, driving Kassereth to a corner. As far as Percy could see, his host was forced to burn through his mana twice as fast just to keep up. What an absolute monster! It wasn't hard to see why. On closer inspection, faint patterns covered the axes. These weren't deliberate enchantments like Percy's. They resembled natural ripples engraved into the steel in shifting shades of gray. This time, there was no doubt about it, this truly was the result of a blessing. If its effect wasn't obvious enough, the intel they'd gathered before the fight sealed the deal. Unlike Gabe's blessing of heat, which only affected his fire affinity, thus making it difficult to incorporate it into his light spells in a balanced manner, Lothsalath's blessing was one perfectly tailored to his metal mana, greatly elevating the strength of his constructs. Percy sighed. "I guess there's no avoiding it. We'll have to go all out." Just how lucky do you have to be to end up with both a composite affinity and the right blessing for it? In theory, it was possible to acquire both with the right treasures and a matching ring of sacrilege, but Lothsalath's background was already known. It was clear he'd been born like this, having inherited everything from his mother who was a goddess. Of course, Percy had expected to meet prodigies of this caliber in the finals, so this didn't surprise him that much. All things considered, he wasn't as worried about the fight, since he knew his Magiscript was potent enough to get him and Kassereth through the 5th round. It was something else that gnawed at him. "I hope your mommy isn't watching us right now," he thought with a sigh, grabbing a fragment of Kassereth's long swords flying toward him. The shard clanged against his palm with a faint vibration, the lingering heat from the collision still permeating the broken weapon. It was about a quarter of the construct's blade, taken from the lower midsection, closer to the base than the tip. Percy held it horizontally with both hands, shaping his domain into a rune. If he helped his host fight back against their opponent's domain, he could probably slow down their mana consumption, but not enough to outlast Lothsalath. Percy was confident that enchanting the weapons was the best use of his willpower. Ignoring Kassereth, who was still spewing liquid metal from his pores and fighting desperately to hold back the throwing axes, Percy used his instantaneous imprint spell to stamp the first enchantment into the shard. He didn't stop after one, soon adding a second, and a third. 8 runes in total for each of the simplified unit cells, and half a dozen unit cells on the fragment, 3 on either side of the blade. The pseudo-enchantments were twice the size of his fingernails, but contained less than half the runes he was using on Remir. It was a necessary compromise, if he wanted to apply the enchantments fast enough to matter. He left wide gaps between them too, spacing them precisely to allow for 4 times as many unit cells later. Not easy for an amateur, but Percy was no longer one. He'd already drawn millions of runes in his life before this trip to Thescala, so he knew what he was doing. Once finished, he pulled a sliver of metal mana from his host's core, pouring it into the self-repair enchantments. At the same time, he willed the fragment to snap into 4 pieces, making sure each contained at least 1 functional unit cell. Regenerating the fragments into copies of the original, he lined them up and fused them, melting the steel at their edges. A hiss of vapor escaped as the molten seams cooled against the arena's chill air. The sections near the tip were supposed to be narrower, so he reshaped the weapon slightly, taking extra care not to distort the enchantments or the spacing. Flicking the self-repairs off and on again, he had them memorize the new template before passing it to Kassereth. He didn't even bother to add a hilt to the weapon. It wasn't necessary. All done. Use this to make more, he said, getting a nod back. Unlike the improvised tactics they'd employed to get through some of the previous matches, this was something they'd practiced extensively before the tournament. Smashing the sword into pieces, Kassereth funneled mana into the runes, producing multiple copies of the enchanted longsword. The air shimmered faintly around the forming weapons, the heated metal warping the view of the battlefield beyond. The process slowed his output slightly, giving Lothsalath even more ground. By now, the blessed Thescalan controlled over 3/4 of the battlefield and still had over half of his mana reserves left, while Kassereth was down to 1/3. Still, Percy didn't panic, knowing that conceding another step now would be worth it later. Soon, Kassereth had a stockpile of new weapons to throw into the fray. They cut through the air like crossbow bolts, colliding with the spinning axes in an instant. Unlike before, most of the swords survived the first impact, allowing Kassereth to reuse them. The sharp metallic crashes echoed across the arena, each hit sending sparks scattering into the dust-filled air. Did you know this text is from a different site? Read the official version to support the creator. Lothsalath still advanced, but did so much more slowly. Kassereth's mana drain eased too. It's working. Do it again, the blue exclaimed, his heart skipping a beat. Percy didn't need to be told twice, or even once for that matter. Before handing over the first longsword, he'd kept an extra fragment for himself. While Kassereth fought, Percy had been busy adding more runes to it. There. Switch to this one, he said a few seconds later, passing Kassereth a longsword with twice as many runes as before, starting work on the next one. Worried as he was about someone recognizing the vault's enchantments, Percy would be lying if he said he wasn't excited about this battle. Without the blessing, Lothsalath was probably still stronger than Kassereth, but not by much. This was the perfect opportunity for him to test how his Magiscript stacked up against an actual blessing, with everything else being about equal, more or less. Once Kassereth replaced his constructs again, he saw another significant improvement. For the first time since the start of the battle, his swords began winning against the throwing axes, surviving more clashes and pushing their counterparts back. Progress was modest at first, but the tide was turning. Lothsalath seemed to notice that too. Whether or not he saw the intricate unit cells empowering the longswords, he clearly realized that Kassereth was up to something. Not willing to give him another chance to upgrade his attacks, he added more pressure into his own. Like Kassereth, Lothsalath could split lightning mana from his core to superheat his constructs. The arcs of electricity snapped like whip cracks, briefly illuminating the steel storm between them. It generally wasn't a good idea to do that unless one wanted to end the fight quickly. While it added to the weapon's offensive power, the charged blades were less mana efficient than regular steel. Still, the blessed disciple probably understood that he had to forsake some of his mana advantage to stop Kassereth before he grew even stronger. Percy's host responded in kind, infusing his long swords with lightning too. In theory, both sides burned their reserves at the same rate now. If anything, Kassereth was slightly ahead. Had this been the start of the battle, this would have been a great place to be. Only, it looked like Kassereth's core would still dry up first, thanks to the existing gap between them. Should that happen, the battle would be over. Gritting his gums, Percy was forced to interrupt his enchanting session halfway through, giving Kassereth a half-baked construct. It was better than his current swords, but he hadn't managed to add as many unit cells as he would have liked. Acting fast, Kassereth spent some time to replace his weapons again, easing up on the lightning infusion. This lowered his mana consumption to a more bearable level, at the cost of yielding more ground to Lothsaleth. Still, everyone involved understood that was only a temporary setback. As soon as the third wave of constructs was ready, Kassereth pressed forward again. His opponent was forced to spend even more mana just to keep up. Eventually, he realized it wasn't sustainable, giving up a lot of territory to preserve his mana. Unfortunately for him, Percy had already resumed working on the enchantments. The fourth round took a bit longer, as he also had to fit the unit cells he'd been missing from before into the longsword. Still, Lothsaleth could do nothing but watch as Percy perfected the construct, passing Kassereth a weapon densely covered in runes. Even holding it felt different this time, the steel faintly humming with layered enchantments as flashes of mana coursed through the intricate grid of unit cells, further amplifying their effects. "There you go. Just put that bastard out of our misery," he said. Their opponent's attacks grew even more erratic. Likely realizing that he no longer had any hopes of winning a frontal contest, Lothsaleth spread out his axes in search of an opening. Kassereth wasn't an idiot, however, adjusting the formation of his own constructs to intercept them. The battle was already over. A new flock of decorated longswords smashed through the spinning axes with ease, advancing through the aerial battlefield. Shards of steel and sparks rained down, tinkling against the floor in a steady metallic drizzle. To his credit, Lothsaleth fought until his last drop of mana, until the final steel fragment under his control got violently knocked down to the ground, and until his domain got whittled down to nothing. Was it stubbornness, or persistence driving him? Or simply the pride of a spoiled son not accustomed to losing? Percy didn't know which one it was, nor did he care. With his runecrafting task now over, he was free to pile his domain onto Kassereth's, seeking to end the fight a moment sooner. There was no point dragging it out. Everyone had already seen everything he and his host could do. The stadium's enchantments flared, halting the swords before they skewered Lothsaleth. The sudden stillness felt almost unnatural after the relentless clash of metal, like the air itself was holding its breath. The fifth round was over. Percy and Kassereth would advance to the quarterfinals. Even better, Percy's enchantments had proven themselves against both a blessing and an opponent of arguably superior skill. Neither he nor his host felt much joy in their victory, however, for a very simple reason. That was the last of our trump cards. "So what, do we just empty the vials into the water?" Percy asked. "I guess that's all the instructions say," Kassereth replied, retrieving the 3 ingredients from his spatial pin. The organizers had spaced out the matches in the second phase of the tournament more partly to give the participants a chance to rest, and partly to milk the audience as much as possible. There was a 3-hour break between fights, and another 2 days between rounds. Since Percy and Kassereth had fought in the very first match, they had plenty of time to go through the ritual now that the latter had gathered a full set of ingredients. They already had a fair idea of who their next opponents might be, so they knew the enhanced physique was unlikely to help much during the 6th round, but there was a good chance it would during the semifinals. After forging a large, cylindrical tub out of steel mana, they flew to the base of the pillar, collecting cold water from the ocean. They'd even asked around beforehand to make sure the salt in the seawater wouldn't mess with the ritual. Returning to their room, they soaked into the frigid liquid. The Thescalian Sea was always cold, especially this far from the equator, but it didn't feel too bad. Percy credited that to Kassereth's grade and the diluted traces of his ancestral physique, the very thing they were about to improve. He once again suppressed the temptation to snatch the vials from his host's hands. Now that Kassereth had a full set, Percy could potentially undergo 2 rounds of the ritual if he brought the ingredients back to his main body. Still, it didn't make sense to burn bridges with the man at this point. Sighing, he watched Kassereth uncork the gemstone containers, emptying them into the bath. The effect was immediate. A faint red glow spread in the water, causing it to bubble. At first, Percy was afraid it would boil away at this rate, long before the 2 days were up. He soon realized that the liquid wasn't flying away from the bath, however, but inwards, trying to seep into Casritha's body. The man's scales did nothing to stop the substance, the magical mixture aggressively finding its way through the gaps between them. Casritha's heart started beating faster, violently pumping blood through his body. It made Percy feel quite hot, but that didn't last very long. An indescribable chill gripped his host's bones the very next instant, thanks to the abyssal moss. No doubt. It reminded Percy of Mickey's soul-freezing mana. Only, the feeling wasn't restricted to certain mana channels this time. It freely permeated every centimeter of flesh. Then came a third sensation, a wave of numbness that caused their muscles to alternate between tensing and relaxing, leaving Percy and Casrith weak and unable to control their body. The instructions didn't mention how unpleasant this would be, the Thescalan groaned. At least, they'd had the foresight to keep the water level low enough to avoid drowning. It was barely deep enough to cover their face if they ducked, but they could easily breathe by leaning back against the wall and keeping their nostrils above the surface. "Suck it up," Percy said. "There are millions of people out there, watching your fights with envy. I bet they all wish they could be in your shoes." "The hell's a shoe?" Casrith asked. "Now you're just messing with me. Surely you know that most sapients in the universe have feet," Percy replied, rolling his eyes. His host chuckled, not denying it. "Say, what happens if you go through the ritual twice?" Percy asked, changing the topic. He wasn't going to complete his first set of ingredients until after their next victory, and he was planning to spend his last reward on the affinity-changing treasure for his friends. This meant that a second bath wasn't a realistic option. Even so, he couldn't help his curiosity. This story is posted elsewhere by the author. Help them out by reading the authentic version. The more you do it, the stronger the effect. That's how the leaders of the ancestral lineage sect built up their physiques to their current level. But the closer your body is to the person you're inheriting from, the smaller the gains become, Casrith explained. Percy frowned. "How much smaller?" "A lot," Casrith shrugged. "A second bath would only give me something like 5% of the first one's benefits. A third would do even less. Once your body surpasses the source of the heart blood, the gains become insignificant. Why do you think the ancestors have only made it this far after thousands of generations?" Percy nodded in understanding. For people like him and Casrith who lacked the ancestral lineage sect's bloodline, undergoing a second ritual didn't make much sense. Without the ability to preserve the purity of their blood, they'd only be wasting valuable ingredients. It would take several rounds to see any notable improvements past the first bath, and most of that effort would be lost on their kids. Multiple baths were only worthwhile for those with the bloodline. Leaving aside the fact that they could pass all the benefits over after their death, their kids were also more likely to inherit the bloodline themselves, thus giving the original owners of the physique another avenue to preserve their lineage. Still, Percy was an outsider. He wasn't planning to stay on Thescala much longer, nor did he care about using the ingredients efficiently. Even if the ritual worked on a human, there was a chance it wouldn't be very effective. With a lower starting point and a body less compatible with the physique, he might need multiple baths just to receive the same benefits as Casrith. Perhaps it wouldn't be a terrible idea to look for a second set of ingredients, should the opportunity present itself. If he didn't find an affinity-changing treasure that he liked by the end of the tournament, it might be worth claiming a second vial of heartblood. In any case, Percy and Casrith said nothing more. The uncomfortable sensations intensified over the course of the first day, peaking around midnight. Neither Percy nor his host were having a great time, but they'd chosen to spend their time thinking about their next match instead of complaining about the ritual. Technically, their opponent was still up in the air, since they hadn't stayed in the stadium long enough to watch the fight after theirs. However, the odds were heavily stacked in favor of a certain gravity user. Suffice to say, they were operating under the assumption that they'd be fighting him. The man was supposedly good at deflecting hostile spells and throwing his opponents off balance without spending much mana. If the rumors were true, They were in for a tough fight, especially since the gravity user would now know not to give them enough time to enchant their constructs. Percy had some ideas on how to counter him, but nothing concrete yet. The ritual stopped torturing them by the dawn of the second day, evident by the scarce rays of sunlight reluctantly spilling into the dim cavern. Their body had already begun to acclimate to its new state, over 80% of the ingredients having been absorbed. In theory, they could already end the ritual without missing out on much, but nobody in their right mind would consider wasting even a drop of the priceless materials just to save a few hours. Not long after nightfall, Kasrith grew a little impatient. The ritual wasn't over yet, but he shifted slightly inside the container, testing his body. Percy perked up too, curious about the changes. Flicking their forked tongue, they realized they could perceive the temperature of their surroundings much more accurately than before. The walls of the cavern felt warmer the closest they were to the tunnel's entrance, due to bathing under the gentle sunlight the whole day. The difference was barely worth mentioning, but it was quite telling that Kasrith was now capable of detecting it. Even the bathwater felt less cold, albeit for a bunch of different reasons. The liquid itself had warmed up due to their body temperature, while their flesh had grown colder after the ritual. At the same time, most of the abyssal moss had been consumed, and their resistance to cold was now heightened. Clenching and unclenching his fists, Percy experienced a surge of strength now that the numbness was starting to fade. It was hard to tell exactly how much stronger they'd grown, but he felt they could rip their previous self apart with their bare hands if they wanted. As for the potency of their venom, they had nothing to test it against, but Percy didn't doubt it had also risen to a whole new level, along with their resistance to it. There should still be a few hours left until they exhausted the lingering traces of the ingredients in the bath, and nobody had come looking for them yet, so they weren't in a rush to end the ritual. That said, Percy couldn't help but pull up his status, wondering if it had anything to say about Kasrith's new body. Mutations. A greater Thescalan physique greatly enhances one's physical strength and the toughness of their body. Greatly enhances one's resistance to high or low temperatures and sharpens their thermal sense. Greatly enhances one's resistance to toxins and the potency of their venom. To nobody's surprise, the gravity user had prevailed against his previous opponent, earning his place in Kasrith's sixth match. He was one of the strangest mages they'd faced in the tournament. His attacks weren't lethal or even that dangerous, however. He simply fired the occasional blast of concentrated force, mostly to keep Kasrith under pressure while conserving his own mana. Most of his efforts went into veering Kasrith's longswords off course. He accomplished that using short bursts of gravity mana seamlessly integrated into his domain. They allowed him to shove the constructs away whenever they were about to hit, sending them plummeting into the mist-shrouded depths below. But he didn't stop at defense. Every now and then, his domain expanded, exerting a strange influence that somehow permeated both Kasrith's domain and Percy's. It applied opposing forces on Kasrith's body and the greatsword he was using to fly, threatening to unseat him. More than once, the man succeeded, knocking Kasrith off the construct and forcing him to waste mana to forge a new one. At the same time, the latter had to guard against the inevitable rain of gravity blasts that always seemed to accompany the man's attempts. That alone wasn't enough to harm Kasrith, but it was extremely effective at gnawing at his reserves. Even worse, the gravity user always seemed to time his disturbances whenever Percy tried to enchant a longsword, never giving him a chance to recycle his winning strategy from the previous round. How annoying! Kasrith spat mentally, clicking his tongue as he clawed his way onto what felt like his 20th greatsword since the start of the battle. We can't keep going like this. My consumption isn't as bad as the last fight, but he's spending even less mana than the guy with the scar. Well, I've got an idea, but you're not going to like it, Percy said. Go on, Kasrith replied, though he sounded guarded. What if I stamp a few lightness runes directly into our body? Percy didn't bother to explain his reasoning, Kasrith's silence indicating that he understood him. Their opponent didn't seem to knock them off their greatsword by applying an external force on them. His domain appeared to simply amplify Thescala's existing gravity while randomizing its direction. If it worked like Percy thought it did, there was a good chance the lightness runes would negate most of its effects. If Percy planted the metallic seals directly into their skin, their opponent wouldn't be able to remove them, allowing Casrith to remain on his greatsword long enough for them to upgrade their weapons too. Percy could apply lightness and sharpness runes on the longswords, allowing them to fly fast enough to reach their target before he managed to deflect them. "Sounds painful," Casrith said, a grimace marring his face. "It will be, but think of the sweet rewards. Besides, the damage isn't permanent. We can use your bloodline to fix everything after the fight." Casrith didn't seem happy at all. Percy didn't blame him for it, as he wasn't looking forward to mutilating himself either. Still, this was the only semi-viable plan either of them had come up with. The next time their opponent pulled the greatsword from underneath Casrith's tail seemed to seal the deal, causing the latter to give Percy a mental nod. "Do it. Just make sure to beat the bastard." Not wasting any time, Percy drew some liquid metal from his host's sternum, along with some additional lightning mana to superheat it. Between Casrith's resistance to his own affinities and his new mutation, Percy knew it would take a lot of heat to brand the symbol through their fortified scales. Gathering his domain into the red-hot liquid, he allowed his spectral trait to take over, pressing his palm against Casrith's chest. The pain made him wince, or was that Casrith's doing? Either way, their muscles sizzled, the acrid smell of burnt flesh stinging their nostrils as a wave of agony rippled through their body. Their ribs cracked and their lungs cooked, but Percy didn't pause until he felt the controlled lightness rune click in his mind, responding to his will. Unauthorized reproduction. This story has been taken without approval. Report sightings. Casrith's eyes watered, but they still managed to catch their opponent's frown through a film of tears. The man clearly realized they were up to something. Knowing they were swiftly running out of time, Percy used both hands to brand another pair of runes, the first on the other side of his host's chest, the other on his belly. The hostile domain locked onto Casrith, trying to pull him away from his greatsword. The latter tightened his tail's grip on the hilt, clinging on for dear life. At the same time, Casrith fired some of his flying longswords against the gravity mage, pressuring him into halting his assault. Sure enough, the man was forced to withdraw his domain, using it to deflect the projectiles. "Just a couple more," Percy said, more to reassure himself than his host. "I think they're helping." The effect of the enchantments was subtle, but this was the first time they'd managed to resist their opponent's efforts to throw them off. Percy didn't think that was a coincidence. Casrith remained silent, buying as much time as he could for Percy to brand the next few runes. Bracing himself, Percy did just that, the gravity mage's domain growing less effective with every new lightness rune they suffered. Before long, they found themselves able to stick to the greatsword with relative ease. Not wanting to leave things up to chance, Percy still grabbed the opportunity to engrave a few lightness runes onto the greatsword too, just to be sure. "Let's end this farce already. I'm so done with this bastard," Casrith said. "Agreed," Percy replied, already beginning to stamp one unit cell after another onto a longsword. The rest of the battle held no surprises. The gravity mage had done an admirable job preparing a counter to Percy's runecrafting before the fight, but he didn't seem to have a response to Percy's solution. As expected, Casrith eventually gathered enough enchanted constructs to fight back, his opponent no longer capable of deflecting them as effortlessly as before. That was not to say that the gravity mage was entirely out of options, but he no longer had any good ones. He was forced to apply his gravity mana more directly, wrapping it around his body into a dense, invisible force field. The spell was far harder for Percy and Casrith to penetrate, buying the man a few minutes. However, it also cost several times more mana to maintain. A while later, the gravity mage's reserves looked like they were about to dry up. With a deep sigh, he voiced his surrender, clearly unwilling to plunge into the cold ocean. 3 days later, Casrith stood in the arena face-to-face with his seventh opponent, waiting for the semifinals to begin. It was a female Thescalon, the one they'd been expecting to fight ever since they saw the brackets. Interestingly, she was a disciple of the ancestral lineage sect, the very organization that had generously donated this year's main reward. However, she didn't possess the special bloodline that made her sect famous across Thescala, but a different one that nevertheless synergized with her enhanced physique just as well, if not better. In fact, Percy had been shocked to learn about it, since this was easily the most powerful bloodline he'd ever heard of. Save for his own, of course. It was called Mana Lock. It exerted a powerful effect that spread across a wider area than a domain cast by a mage at the same grade and could simultaneously affect multiple opponents. Anyone under its mysterious influence would find it almost impossible to draw mana from their core. With enough effort, they could still pull out a trickle enough to fire a single weak spell, or to defend themselves against one. Still, it wasn't easy to fight under these conditions. If it caught somebody off guard while flying, it could even send them to their doom. In other words, this bloodline could rob even the most powerful mages of all their weapons. Its only downside was that it affected its owner as much as her opponents, but that was probably why the ancestral lineage sect had accepted the woman into their ranks. They clearly thought that their legendary physique was the perfect match for her ability, since a stronger body was as lethal a weapon as any under the bloodline's effect. "How good are you in close combat?" Percy asked. "Not very," Kasrith replied. "Why the hell would a blue bother learning how to fight with their hands?" Percy pointed at the woman with his chin, causing his host to sigh. "Thoughts?" Kasrith asked. "Leave this one to me." Percy shrugged. "Just support me with your domain, assuming it still works." Luckily, Percy was used to physical fights. Granted, he'd never done it in such a powerful body. Not just a blues, but a mutated one as well. He most certainly wasn't used to fighting without feet. That said, he'd possessed enough weird creatures over the years that he'd grown proficient at adapting his fighting style on a whim, learning to wield all sorts of foreign body parts and unfamiliar appendages. On top of that, he'd spent enough time in Kasrith's body that he understood it well enough. Of course, their opponent probably had centuries of experience fighting like this, so Percy didn't think this would be an easy fight, especially since her bloodline wasn't the only thing they had to worry about. "Well, whatever. I already got my complete set of ingredients. Worst case scenario, I fail to get Nesha and Elaine's affinity-changing treasure. It would suck for the girls, but Percy could look for another one in the future." That was not to say he wouldn't do his best to win, however. Taking over Kasrith's body, he assumed a fighting stance. He was about to pounce as soon as the announcer declared the start of the battle, though the woman caught him off guard by raising her hand first. "Wait!" she yelled, causing even the gold-trimmed elder to stop in his tracks. "Before we begin, I want to propose a wager." "I'm listening," Kasrith said, the curiosity in his soul matching Percy's. "Do you still have any of my sect's ingredients that you haven't used?" the woman asked. "I'll bet mine against yours. Anything you have, as many as you have, both the primary and the secondaries. 1-for-1, winner takes all." Kasrith creased his brow, though he didn't rush to answer. He'd already used his own ingredients, so they only had Percy's. Naturally, it was up to the latter to decide whether to gamble his hard-won prizes away. The announcer and the crowd didn't press them for a decision either. If anything, the spectators only grew more excited, appearing as invested in the wager as the participants. This was exactly the kind of drama that they craved. But Percy didn't care about anyone's opinion except for his own. It was his precious ritual on the line. On one hand, accepting the wager would be reckless and arguably unnecessary. He'd already won both the bath ingredients and the life-extending leaf, his main reasons for signing up to the tournament in the first place. So he didn't care about the final 2 rounds as much. Even if he lost to the woman, something that was quite possible, it wouldn't really affect his gains from the trip. Viewed that way, refusing was a no-brainer. Then again, the ritual might not work as well on his human body as it had on Kasrith's. A second helping might fix that. Even if the additional bath proved unnecessary, Percy wouldn't say no to a smaller boost, or to the possibility of gifting the ingredients to somebody else. At the end of the day, it all came down to how confident he felt about beating her. "Why are you gambling for ingredients anyway? Can't you just request more from your sect?" Kasrith asked, clearly buying time for Percy to make his mind up. The woman shrugged. I did ask, obviously. It's no secret that my fighting style depends heavily on my physical strength, but my elders still refuse to give me another set, since I don't have the right bloodline to preserve the lineage. They told me to try and win as many as I can from this year's tournament, like everyone else. Whether you accept is naturally up to you, the announcer interjected, his booming voice cutting through the arena. However, I should remind you that wagers like these are a sanctioned tradition of the tournament. Should you agree, I will personally ensure that both sides honor the result. Kasrith swallowed hard. Externally, he nodded at the gold-trimmed elder, though he sounded more worried inwardly as he addressed Percy. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your own stuff, but can you please not run away if you lose the bet? I'll be the one in trouble. Who do you take me for? Percy shot back, offended. Truth be told, the thought had crossed his mind, if only because his backstabbing host had it coming. But the woman hadn't done anything to deserve being cheated, so Percy was going to uphold his word. Still, it was a good thing he had the option of fleeing. It would prevent Kasrith from screwing him over. I accept, he said at last, taking control of his host's mouth. I'll wager a complete set of ingredients, he clarified, his borrowed heart clenching as the words left his lips. He wasn't certain he would win, but he'd overcome worse odds in the past. Besides, he wasn't planning to return to Thescala anytime soon, so this would probably be his only chance to secure additional ingredients, and he hadn't made it this far by letting precious opportunities slip through his fingers. Very well, the announcer acknowledged, before turning to the crowd. The first semifinal will be fought between Jethsethi of the Ancestral Lineage sect and Kasrith of the Broken Fang sect. In addition, each side has wagered 1 vial of Greater Thescalan Heartblood, 1 vial of Abyssal Moss, and 1 conflux of 1,000 toxins. Let the battle begin. The stands roared with boiling anticipation, as Percy rushed to draw as much mana as he could before his opponent's bloodline took hold. He barely managed to summon a blob of liquid metal in his hand when a suffocating feeling gripped his host's core, choking the flow to a halt. It felt like wax forced through narrow pipes, each drop demanding extreme effort. This story originates from a different website. Ensure the author gets the support they deserve by reading it there. I'll focus on protecting our body with my domain and forcing more mana out, Kasrith said. Do with it what you will. Percy nodded internally, stacking his own domain on top of his host's, wrapping it around their flesh and the metal in their hand. Normally, mages could use their domains in all sorts of ways to complement their magic, but spreading their willpower thin didn't make sense in a simple melee like this. The woman seemed to agree. At least Percy hadn't felt her domain anywhere near him. Not wasting time, she pressed her thumb and index finger through her upper lip and into the base of her fangs, causing her scaled cheeks to puff up. Then, she spat a mouthful of purple liquid onto both hands, the venom dripping from her long, sharpened nails. The droplets hissed where they landed. Percy knew that the Thescalan's venom wasn't corrosive, but it did evaporate rapidly when exposed to air. An acrid stench filled the space, sharp enough to sting Kasrith's nostrils and tighten his throat. The woman must have managed to draw some mana out too, judging from the increased concentration sitting in her head. The substance wasn't visible through anything but mana sense yet, but Percy was already aware of the female disciple's affinity. He was also confident she'd gathered even more mana than him and Kasrith, an impressive feat, considering that her bloodline had probably affected her a fraction of a second sooner. She pounced toward Percy, who'd barely managed to shape the fluid in his hand into a steel dagger. The weapon would give him some extra reach, though not as much as he would have liked, along with more piercing power. However, he'd probably have to extract more mana before it had a real impact on the battle. Scary, he thought as the woman's gaping maw snapped right where his throat had been, her clawed hands missing the scales on his host's chest by mere millimeters. Percy had fought many Thescalans over the course of the tournament, but never from this close, nor while being in full control of Kasrith's body. Seeing his opponent's mouth stretch wide enough to swallow a person whole, her eyes burning with cold ferocity, and the unnatural way in which she slithered across the tiled floor. He felt he was fighting a woman-shaped snake more than a mage. The scrape of her claws against the stone released a deeply unsettling screech that set Percy on edge. Cautiously moving back, he tried to give himself space, brandishing his hastily forged dagger more as a deterrent than a genuine weapon. He first had to adapt to the woman's speed before he even considered attacking. The female disciple knew how to capitalize on her advantage, however. Right when Percy thought that the threat of his steel blade had brought the woman's lunge to a halt, she surprised him by pressing on, allowing the dagger to stab right into her throat. Percy felt some resistance as the metallic tip met the hardened scales. Still, the weapon sank into her flesh easily enough. Warm blood gushed forth like a fountain, wetting Casritha's fingers. Percy didn't feel happy about his apparent victory, knowing full well what his opponent was capable of. Sure enough, a spark of amusement lit up in the dying woman's eyes, her fatally wounded body soon growing transparent. In less than a second, she faded away completely, as did the injured flesh holding Percy's dagger in place, and the sticky liquid dirtying his hands. At the same time, he felt two series of deep lacerations burning on his host's body. One by Casritha's waist, the other below his armpit. As for the woman who had injured him, she stood a few meters away, licking the blood off her fingers, before spitting more venom onto her claws. I didn't even realize that I was affected, Percy thought with a groan. He'd expected this to happen at some point, of course, having watched her previous battle. As powerful a combination as her physique and bloodline were, she wouldn't have made it this far into the tournament without her mind affinity. Unlike Percy's illusions on Remir that he tended to fashion out of mana for everyone to see, the woman's illusions only existed in his own head. From the crowd's perspective, Percy looked like he'd lost his mind. There shouldn't be anything on the arena besides the two contestants. To him, the illusions were far harder to see through. They tricked all the senses, mundane and magical. Up until the last second, Percy had felt he was stabbing a real person, complete with a blue core shining brightly in her chest, body heat spreading outward from her blood vessels, the thick stench of iron spilling forth from the wound, and even a soft pulse sending its rhythmic beats through the knife. Percy had no idea whether his main body's eyes would have seen through the falsehood. Perhaps the woman would have struggled to trick his soul vision without understanding it. Either way, Percy didn't have access to his favorite mutation at the moment, so he was entirely at his opponent's mercy. His only solace was the fact that the female disciple couldn't do this very often. Each short-lived illusion appeared to consume a ton of mana. Gathering the limited resource under the influence of her bloodline was as difficult for her as it was for him. In fact, he was confident her move just now had exhausted everything she'd accumulated since the start of the battle. Unfortunately, the damage was already done. The wounds weren't that troublesome, but the toxins spreading through Casritha's veins were a lot harder to deal with. A wave of nausea slammed into Percy's borrowed head, causing his surroundings to turn blurry as insidious tendrils of weakness seeped into his muscles. The ritual had elevated his host's resistance to the substance, of course, but it had raised the potency of the woman's venom just as much. In fact, Percy was willing to bet that his opponent had undergone more rituals than Casrith. Not waiting for him to regain his bearings, the female disciple was already upon him again. Percy didn't think he'd have to worry about a second mind blast this soon, but the venom had still left him in a bad place. Adding what little mana his host had been able to gather, Percy extended his weapon's reach slightly, hoping it would help. His wild swings did appear to give the woman pause, keeping her at bay. Percy slithered closer and closer to the edge of the arena, doing everything he could to buy time, knowing that strengthening his weapon was his best shot. Still, he understood that his opponent wasn't in a rush either. She was clearly happy to let her venom do its job as she accumulated more mana, opting for caution over unnecessary risk. The more Percy focused on the battle, the more the crowd's cheers dimmed in his ears, leaving only the rasp of his own ragged breaths to anchor him. "You're going to lose all your ingredients at this rate." Casritha's voice rang through Percy's soul, carrying a hint of poorly concealed glee. At least the Thescalan hadn't made any efforts to actively sabotage him, But Percy could tell that his host didn't much care if they got eliminated this late into the tournament. "Just do your job and let me worry about the wager," Percy spat, not bothering with Kassereth. The fight wasn't going as well as he would have liked, but he hadn't given up yet. As difficult as it was to handle the woman's illusions and venom, Percy had his own advantages to rely on. Unlike his opponent, who had to exhaust her mana whenever she produced a new illusion, Percy could keep pouring metal into his construct, slowly building his strength up over the course of the battle. At the same time, his host's body was working overtime to purge the toxins, and Percy was rapidly adapting to both the woman's movements and his own physical capabilities. Whether he would last long enough to tip the scales in his favor was still up in the air, but he hadn't bet his hard-earned resources on nothing. A few breaths later, the woman left herself wide open again. Percy realized it was a trick as soon as she allowed his dagger to sink into her exposed torso, but it was already too late. Once more, his opponent's injured flesh vanished rapidly as his host's brain registered the new wounds on his tail. At least Percy had been careful to guard Kassereth's throat from every angle, else they might have lost already. Even so, the fresh injection of venom was most unwelcome. Percy swayed back and forth, struggling to stay upright as the woman's attacks grew more aggressive. By now, his dagger had reached the size of a short sword, which definitely helped against his unarmed opponent. Still, it wasn't enough to bridge the growing gap between them, especially since the weapon felt heavier in his grasp with every passing moment, each swing a monumental challenge. "I need to do something fast, or I'm really going to lose," he thought in alarm, racking his brain for anything that might help. Adding an enchantment or two onto the construct would make it a lot easier to wield, but his instantaneous imprint spell was difficult to cast in this situation. His thoughts were a complete slog thanks to the venom, and the woman kept him under a lot of pressure. In theory, he could give Kassereth control of their body for a few seconds, but the man had made it clear that he didn't have much experience fighting like this. They might lose before Percy drew even the first unit cell onto the blade. "It doesn't need to be a complete unit cell," he reminded himself. The structural integrity enchantment wasn't necessary, as the woman would struggle to damage the weapon with brute strength alone. Regular blue-grade steel wrapped in a couple of domains was plenty for this kind of battle. Percy only needed sharpness and lightness runes to wield the sword better, along with controlled self-repairs to replicate the enchantments. "Just 2 unit cells with 5 runes each," he thought before mentally shaking his head. No, not even that. Only one of the unit cells had to contain everything. The other could be a simple self-repair, without even a control rune. As long as he managed to copy the larger unit cell once, he'd have everything he needed to produce as many of them as necessary. So, really, he only had to draw a total of 7 runes on the construct. Could he do it while defending against the woman's relentless onslaught? Maybe not, but it wasn't like he had an alternative. If this failed, he'd lose anyway, so it wouldn't hurt to try. "The sword is large enough for now," he told Kassereth. "Stop adding to its bulk. Do you want me to pass you lightning mana instead?" the Thescalon asked. "No. Keep gathering metal mana. We're going to need it later. But use it defensively for now. If you can block some of her attacks, it'll help a lot. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon." Percy didn't wait for a response, splitting a sliver of his attention and just as much willpower to stamp the first rune onto the base of the blade. The woman didn't miss the chance to slash at him again, though Kassereth reacted just in time to gather some liquid steel onto their forearm, a blooming patch of metal stopping 2 of the claws. Still, enough venom found its way into their circulatory system to dull Percy's senses by another step. At least, the lightness rune was fully functional, making the construct a touch easier to swing. Happy with the trade-off, Percy continued to plant one enchantment after another onto the weapon as more tiny shields appeared on Kassereth's body. Most of the woman's slashes still found their mark, since it was impossible to accurately predict her attacks. Her mind mana, which she happily used whenever she accumulated enough, didn't make things any easier. Every few blows, she spat more venom onto her hands, giving Percy a chance to draw an extra rune. Before long, His host's pale body was a mess of reddish-purple cuts and metallic patches, but at least the initial set of enchantments on the short sword were complete. That was only the first part of his plan, however. If he wanted to win, he'd have to scale the runes to cover the whole weapon. Only then would they have enough of an impact on the battle. She'll never give me the chance to do it slowly. I'll have to streamline the process. During their earlier matches, Kasrith had bought him enough time to copy the enchanted fragments and fuse them together, but the current situation didn't allow for that. Knowing he was swiftly running out of time, Percy liquefied the sword completely, taking extra care not to distort the magical symbols even slightly. If he made a mistake, the enchantments would easily lose their effect, and his opponent would never give him a chance to replace them. Moving the two unit cells apart, he allowed the metallic patches on Kasrith's body to flow to the weapon. Flooded with mana, the smaller self-repair soon produced a copy of the larger unit cell where the first one had been. Percy promptly dragged the new enchantment away, making space for more. The woman seemed to realize he was up to something. Changing tactics, she now aimed her attacks directly at the liquefied weapon, trying to destroy it before it solidified. Percy used his own body to shield the construct. He knew suffering more damage wasn't ideal, but losing the sword at this critical moment would be even worse. The pain and dizziness caused him to mess up a few of the new unit cells, wasting some of his efforts. Still, he maintained enough mental clarity to guard the existing ones with everything he had. Even better, the scribing trait reacted violently to the woman's attempts to ruin the enchantments, sending a ripple of cold fury through his soul that sobered him up slightly. The absorbed fiend's influence accelerated Percy's efforts, letting him feed more metal mana into the self-repairs, the unit cells doubling and quadrupling in record pace. Soon, the whole sword was covered in unit cells, but Percy didn't stop. He gathered all the metal mana coating his body, along with the excess that Kasrith was still providing him with. Percy even dragged the steel from the blade's interior to the surface, changing the whole construct into a writhing blob of enchanted liquid. Before long, he had more unit cells than he knew what to do with, his desperation causing something to click in his mind, a new idea taking root. What I'm doing? Using the self-repairs to replicate my runes? Isn't that a form of writing too? Wasn't it? Percy had been using his enchantments like this ever since he invented his spirit-forged effigy. It was just a trick he'd come up with to save time, and it had served him well once he incorporated it into his weapons. But it was so much more. The liquid mana was just another canvas he could draw on, albeit a somewhat inconvenient one. The self-repairs were merely a tool to draw with another quill he could dip in his mana, not that different from his regular method of drawing runes, nor the instantaneous imprints he applied using his borrowed domain. And as with every other type of writing, his spectral trait was the steady hand holding everything together, forcing its rigid standards onto Percy's work. As the realization dawned on him, the unit cells flowed along the liquid surface unbothered, moving closer to one another. The symbols interlocked, the intricate runes now feeling more like a part of the material itself, an inseparable feature of its texture. The woman continued to attack, landing blow after blow. At some point, she stopped reapplying venom to her claws, clearly deciding that it was better to interrupt Percy's forging at all costs than to further mess with his senses. Meanwhile, Percy protected the ever-shifting blob as best as he could, guarding his throat with his free elbow. He even helped Kasrith draw more mana from their core, covering the weapon in enchantments inside out. Deciding he'd gathered enough, he allowed the construct's shape to settle at last. The countless lightness runes robbed the weapon almost entirely of its weight, allowing Percy to wield the enchanted steel as if it was an oversized feather. A flash of silver spun around his borrowed hand, the elongated lump of metal slicing through the air faster than it had any right to. The female disciple realized what was happening a moment too late. By the time she leapt back, Percy had landed his first true counterattack since the start of the battle, and a rather debilitating one at that. A chunk of flesh hit the ground with a wet splotch, a pained groan escaping the woman's lips. Percy's vision was blurry, his other senses not doing much better, but he still scarcely registered the blood spraying from his opponent's left shoulder, and the thick scent of iron filling the arena, drowning out the acrid tang of venom. In his hand, the weapon's rotation came to a halt, revealing its shape. He was holding a long, cylindrical shaft, the texture of the delicate engravings feeling familiar in his palm. Percy used the construct like a cane to stop himself from collapsing, his surroundings spinning as the sting of his countless wounds made even standing a challenge. Still, he couldn't help but smile, feeling at ease beneath the crescent blade, the crimson light reflecting off its blood-stained edge, a clear sign of things to come. Naturally, it wasn't a long sword, or any type of sword, that he'd forged this time. Rather, it was a weapon he was far more comfortable wielding. Even with his opponent now missing an arm, Percy knew that the odds were heavily stacked against him. Yet, he somehow struggled to imagine himself losing with the powerful scythe firmly in his grasp. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Spectral Art. Instantaneous Imprint. Refined - Spectral Art. Instantaneous Armament. Refined.